This video is a collection of 14 short pieces written by August Derleth and published in Weird Tales. I have added timestamps for each story in the video description. Hope you enjoy this one. The Statement of Justin Parker by August W. Derleth. Weird Tales, December 1928. A short, tragic tale. My sole desire in writing this is to place before the public all that I know of the singular facts attending the disappearance of Michael Salisbury, retired from his home on Salisbury Plain. On the 17th day of December last, Michael Salisbury and I had always been the best of friends since childhood. We were together always, until late in 1916, when he went to the African veldt to spend over 7 years there. He had hardly returned, as a matter of fact. It was on the train that I met him, before I left for the veldt. The incident is rather peculiar, and it may aid in a manner to throw light on what followed. I was on board a train leaving London for Liverpool. He had just come in from Liverpool. He came rushing into my compartment, 2 bags in his hands, looking nervously to right and left. Suddenly he saw me. He stopped, dropped his bags, and came over to sit down beside me. "My dear Justin, think of seeing you here." It was obvious to me from the beginning that the man didn't have the least idea what he was saying. "Just returning from the veldt, Michael?" I asked. "Aren't you on the wrong train? This one isn't going anywhere near your home." "Oh no, right train all right. Connections, everything tip-top. Liverpool train, isn't it?" "Yes," said I. "Didn't you just come from there?" "To be sure. But I've the right train. I'll fool them." "Fool them?" I repeated, astonished. "Whatever are you talking about?" I began to think that the veldt had seriously affected Michael Salisbury, my valet and housekeeper. "Fool them" came in on a different train. The prevarication was too obvious. All the while, he was looking from the car windows and staring up and down the aisles at the people in the car. Besides, his valet had been with him to the veldt, of course. He might have returned before him. There was that possibility. We talked for some little time, he in the same disconnected manner, with his eyes on everything at once, especially the car windows. The moment the train stopped at the first station outside London, he jumped up with his bags, which some well-meaning porter had a time before removed from the aisle. On the platform he turned and shouted, "Right after all, Justin, it is the wrong train." I went on to Liverpool, deeply concerned over this strange and unaccountable action on the part of Michael Salisbury. At Liverpool I took a boat for Calais, and 3 months later I was in the Great Veldt, which my friend had just left. I returned from the veldt on the 5th of December. On the 7th, I received a short note from Michael Salisbury. It was somewhat disconnected, but I gathered that he earnestly wished me to come down to his home some distance out on the plain and spend a few days with him. I have given this note to the press, and I believe that it is now in the possession of Messrs. Montague and Saunders of Chancery Lane. I arrived on the 10th of December, and I found a somewhat different Michael Salisbury from the one I had seen some years before. His rooms were hung in solid, unrelieved black. He himself wore nothing but black, stalking around most of the time in a heavy black dressing gown. His hair looked as if it had never been combed, and it had begun to grey at the temples. He had grown a beard which covered more than half his face. He wore a gold-rimmed pince-nez with smoked glasses. These melancholy conditions were wholly contrary to Michael Salisbury's temperament, and you can imagine that I was not slow in asking him what it all meant. But he ventured little by way of explanation. "It's hard to cast a shadow on black, Justin," he said, an offering which whetted my curiosity still more. "But why this aversion to shadows?" I asked at once. "The angle at which a shadow is cast determines for the distant observer exactly the position of the object casting it." This answer puzzled me beyond words. Surely you cannot blame me when I say that I began to cast sidelong glances at Michael Salisbury, fearing at first for his sanity. I remonstrated with him. "Never mind, Justin," he said at last. "Tomorrow I'll tell you all about it." Then he laughed and said, "And I'll explain just how it happened, that I of all people got the wrong train at London a few years ago." And with that he packed me off to bed, for it was already late at night when I arrived. It seemed to me a good sign that he remembered as a jest that adventure of 4 years before, and I went to bed thoroughly convinced that I was to hear something far out of the ordinary. And I was not disappointed. A great majority of those who read this will not attach a bit of significance or truth to the strange narrative that Michael Salisbury told me on the morning of the 11th of December. I admit that I myself doubted the tale at first. "It's rather an incredible tale, Justin," he began. "Nevertheless, I'll vouch for it. When I came from the veldt 4 years ago, I had with me a diamond, which I had taken from the domain of a certain pygmy tribe in the veldt. The diamond was part of a makeshift idol worshipped by these people. These dark-skinned pygmies, strangely enough, were not a fraction as barbaric as their neighbors on all sides. Their priests were the educated men of the village. 3 of them could speak English, having learned it from an English explorer some years before I came. These 3 priests were the historians of the village, the chief tradesmen, and, most important, the guardians of the idol their people worshipped. They were robed in costumes decidedly similar to those of the Egyptian priests of Ra. They wore ornaments of beaten gold and silver, and used great quantities of beaten copper. Under their leadership, the pygmies had established trade with more civilized colonies along the coast. The weapons these pygmies used were a queer sort of blowguns, through which they projected greyish pellets, soft things, composed of thousands of minute microbes insisted, covered by a skin of gelatin. As yet I have no knowledge of these microbes, save that they devour anything they come to, with the exception of glass and metal. When these pellets are shot from the guns, they break upon impact, and the microbes emerge, multiplying so rapidly as to look like a puddle of grey water spreading out on all sides. I have seen an entire tribe of savages wiped out by this horror. Acid is the only thing that will kill it. I think that there is only one other man that I know of who has had experience with these microbes, that is Dr. Maxwell, who terms it the Grey Death. You can easily see that I had plenty of reason to be frightened when I got off the train in London, only to discover that I had been trailed all the way from Africa by one of the pygmy priests, who stood not far behind me on the platform. On the verge of panic, I dashed through the crowd, hoping to elude him, and at last I boarded the first train that came to hand, the train on which you were setting out for Liverpool. When I saw you on the train, you, who knew that I was arriving from the veldt that day, and when I saw that you had already seen me, I had only one course to take, that was to make up something to throw you off the track. I wasn't going to fill you full of silly fears until I was positively sure of my pursuit, though, God knows, I was sure, only I hated to admit it to myself. Then I told you on the spur of the moment that I was playing some silly prank upon my servants. I knew the tale was totally awry, and almost laughed at the expression on your face, but it was the best I could do at the time. I left the train when I was finally sure that I had not been followed, and hired a car to drive me all the way to my home here on the plain. I saw nothing of the pygmy priest for over 4 years after. Then one day last October, while wandering about on the moor, I noticed someone in the ruined chapel. You've seen the chapel, haven't you? I thought you had. At any rate, I thought nothing of the matter at the moment, thinking perhaps that some children had wandered out here, which is not so unusual as it sounds, but when I went closer to look into it, I found on the ground near the ruined structure an amulet of beaten gold. For a moment I was stunned, but I knew whom I had so fortunately spied, and I fled as fast as I could go to the confines of my home. He stopped and pointed all around him with his stick to the black hangings and to his own black robe. I've seen those pygmies strike an object with their accursed pellets, When it was securely out of sight, they judged its position exactly by the angle at which its shadow was thrown. As I said, I didn't quite know how to take this story. At first I was all for the theory that he had made a mistake about being followed, but he would have none of it, and actually became angry when I persisted. Then he showed me the diamond that he had risked his life for, and to do it justice I must say that I thought it well worth such a risk. He had kept the jewel hidden in a secret safe behind his bookcases. Never for once did Michael Salisbury cease his vigilance. He dressed always in black and maintained a constant watch. On one occasion he confided to me that there was nothing he feared so much as the dreaded llama sorcery, a form of animal magnetism practiced by African tribes, and with which he was familiar. He never ventured to explain this magnetism to me. Consequently, I am totally in the dark concerning it. For 5 days nothing happened to break the monotony of life out on the plain. On the 6th day, December 17th, Michael Salisbury vanished. He must have disappeared in the early morning, for we had been having a lengthy conversation the night before, and neither of us had retired before midnight. His clothes were all in his room, with the exception of his black silk dressing gown and his slippers. The first thing I did, when I had ascertained that Michael Salisbury was nowhere about, was to look for the gem. It was gone. As no one but Michael and myself knew the combination and location of that safe, Michael must have taken it. But where could the man have gone in his dressing gown? For some time I was more than confident that he would turn up sometime during the day. I don't know what possessed me to go to the ruined chapel that afternoon, but I went, crossing the moor just as the sun began to sink below the horizon. The chapel was an ordinary affair, except that it was antique. Old stone, broken panes of painted glass, the usual thing. Its floor, however, was unusual. It was of earth, and the insidious advance of the water under the earth had made it soggy. I saw nothing unusual about the structure when I approached it. I made a note of the fact that I would have to hurry to get back to the house before darkness settled over the moor, and began to wonder whether or not Michael would have returned. I entered the chapel, proceeding cautiously over the wet, miry soil, but abruptly I stopped. In the mud before me lay a greyish bubble that contracted and expanded in a sort of rhythmic movement about something that lay in its midst. I bent closer, the better to see what it wagged. As I did so, my handkerchief fell from my coat pocket, fell directly into this grey bubble. More quickly than I can tell, the greyish mass had spread over the cloth and devoured it. Again I caught sight of the object in the midst of it, and in that moment I recognized it. It was that recognition that made me turn and run from the chapel, run haphazardly across the moor. And it was that knowledge that sent me to Liverpool that same night to see whether or not a small brown man, answering to the description of an African pygmy from the veldt, had taken passage on any outgoing ship. As if in confirmation to my recognition of the thing in the chapel, I found that a man such as the one I sought had taken passage bound for Calais, and I have wired there to have him seized on landing, and searched for the gem I know he has. But I have some knowledge of these priests. The gem will not be found, yet it is the only thing I could have done. For the thing in the midst of that seething bubble was the gold-rimmed pince-nez that Michael Salisbury had worn when I last saw him. End of the statement of Justin Parker by August W. Derleth. Occurrence in an Antique Shop by August W. Derleth. Weird Tales. January 1929. Strange was the death of the antiquary. Well, no, it's not that. Then what is it? There seems to be something wrong with the thing, but I can't tell you what it is, nor why I feel that there's some difference about it. Morrison handed the carving to Clavering, who took it and examined it carefully. It was an antique wood of a pirate, in the act of plunging his cutlass into a hapless sailor. The pirate's left arm was extended straight out from his shoulder, much in the attitude of a fencer. His right arm was crooked at the elbow, and in his hand he clutched a long knife which just touched the sailor's bared breast. The expression on the pirate's face was positively fiendish. The face of the kneeling sailor was a picture of abject terror. The two stood on a block of wood, cut to resemble the flooring of a ship. There was dust on the carving. Humph! Well? What a peculiar obsession, Morrison. There isn't a thing different with this piece since I last saw it. It isn't an obsession, Clavering. Isn't the pirate's weapon nearer to the sailor's breast? Not a fraction of an inch. Clavering, you're not lying, just to case me. Nonsense. You've been reading some of that. I have not. But my dear Morrison, I tell you I'm just the same as ever. It's just, well, you know. Tell me, didn't you really notice any difference in the attitude of the figures? No, I didn't. I'm still dubious. Oh, I say, Morrison, let's discuss it. As you will, Clavering, but you have no idea how the thing affects me. It's so strangely suggestive. Suggestive of what? Of nothing. Won't you have a whiskey and soda before you go? No, I must go, Morrison. Clavering stood up. He yawned, then reached for his hat and stick. The two men walked slowly through the shadowy antique shop to the street door. On the threshold, they paused. Morrison sighed. Clavering struck a match and lit his cigarette. I wouldn't let that carving bother me any more if I were you, Morrison. It's not exactly good for you, you know. It's not bothering me, I'm just wondering, that's all. You're trying fairly hard to conceal your nervousness, Morrison, but you can't deceive me. You'd better stop, old fellow, stop worrying. It's easy for you to say. By God, I know that carving is not the same as when I got it. Morrison shuffled back through the aisles in his shop to his rooms beyond. His bedroom slippers made a curious flapping noise. The next night Clavering found Morrison waiting for him, the image grasped tightly in his hand. No doubt about it, Clavering. The pirate's cutlass is plainly sticking in the sailor's breast. You're seeing things, Morrison. Well, look at it. See for yourself. There's absolutely nothing the matter with it. Then what's the matter with me? You're overworked, under a nervous strain, that's all. Absolute nonsense. Oh well. That weapon is going to keep on entering the sailor's body. When it's passed through, something will happen. To the wooden figure. Perhaps, who knows? Morrison turned the image over in his hand, then placed it on the table within easy reach. Did you ever notice that their faces had changed? Oh, come, Morrison, you're overdoing it. That's your view, Clavering, I've got mine. By the way, Morrison, where did you get the thing, if I may ask? I don't know. You don't know? No. It was here in the shop one day. I swear I'd never seen it before. Odd. Yes, it is odd. Too odd to please me. Why don't you burn the thing? I can't bring myself to do it. In some cursed way it reminds me of something. Clavering shot a quick glance at the clock. Is that 9 o'clock, Morrison? Yes. Why? I've got to go. I've an engagement at 9:30. Oh. If I were you, I'd put that carving in storage. Mr. Soames Clavering made a belated appearance at his club 3 nights later. He had no sooner made his entrance than a young antiquary, James Herrick, rose and made his way over to him. I say, Clavering, I hear Morrison's dead. Yes, he's dead. What happened to him? Why, just a week ago I bought a rare Japanese print from him. He had rather a peculiar end. You saw him die? No, no one saw him die. He lay dead in his shop when I came there last night. In his hand he held this. Clavering pulled the wooden image from his pocket and extended it to his friend. Examine the thing, will you, Herrick? See anything queer about it? Well, it's an odd subject to carve, I should say, but beyond that there's nothing wrong. Had I the say, I should have had the cutlass in the body of the sailor, it would maintain a better proportion in the carving. True, it's been just touching the sailor makes it rather awkward. You say Morrison was holding this? Yes. Odd, eh? But wait until you hear all the story. He found the image in his shop one day, hadn't the least idea where it came from, so he says, and was confident that he had never seen it before. At once he told me that he had an uncanny feeling of fright when he looked at the thing. The next night, he insisted that the point of the cutlass had entered the body of the sailor, and that the expressions of the faces had changed. He hinted that the thing suggested something. I gathered that it brought to mind something in his past life that was very similar, and he dreaded the movement of the weapon into the sailor's body, going so far as to state that something would happen when the cutlass passed through the body. By the way, Clavering, have you ever noticed the peculiar resemblance that the face of the sailor has to Morrison? I have, Herrick. I've wondered about it. I'm told that Morrison was once a seaman, perhaps even a pirate of some sort. Who knows? No one. Nobody seems to know much of Morrison. Go on with the story. Well, Morrison insisted that, night after night, the cutlass was being surely plunged into the sailor's body, and I was fully as insistent in my ridicule of his strange obsession. Last night, when I came to see him, I found him dead, with the image in his hand, as I told you. As far as I know, the cause of death is unknown, with heart trouble of an obscure sort plausible. But there was a queer burnt mark on Morrison's breast. I'll be damned if it didn't call to mind some queer stories I've heard about witchcraft. Imagine that, in this enlightened age. I took the image from him. It was just the way it is now, but in a moment I'll show you something. Perhaps Morrison was the victim of some subconscious obsession. Perhaps at some time in his life he killed a sailor under similar conditions, and his conscience conjured his past up before him. It's just plausible. As I said, no one seems to know much about Morrison. At any rate, this morning I got to examining the figure. In the first place, it isn't antique. It resembles a great deal of the work done by a group of old sailors down along the Thames in Limehouse district. In the second place, bend closer, Herrick. 4/5 of this cutlass is entirely free of dust from the point toward the hilt, and if you look closely at the point where the cutlass would naturally have entered the sailor's breast, you will see a faint oval line of compressed dust. End of an Occurrence in an Antique Shop by August W. Derleth. The Devil's Pay by August W. Derleth. Weird Tales, August 1926. A story of black magic. The gondola thudded against the dock, and a man jumped out. He drew his cloak about Liam, and the rings on his fingers flashed in the moonlight as he turned to the gondolier. I shall be gone perhaps for hours, Messer. No matter, Magnificent. I am at your command. I shall wait if need be until the dawn of the second day. Then wait. He turned and plunged into the shadows, which seemed to reach out to engulf him. He walked swiftly, surely. His face was heavily veiled, and his long black cloak reached to his ankles. The few pedestrians who passed him turned and stared for a moment, but went on, failing to comprehend his mutterings. The path was none too smooth, and more than once the man from the gondola stumbled over the cobblestones. At length he modified his pace and began to scrutinize the houses about him. He stopped before a low structure squatting before him like an ugly, repulsive denizen of darkness. He raised his hand to rap upon the panel of the door, but before he could do so, it swung inward. "Come," a voice bade him from the darkness, and he entered. At the farther end of the long hall, he could discern a feeble light issuing from beneath the folds of a heavy curtain. "Follow," came the voice again, and he felt his way along the wall to where the curtain was, and when he reached it, it was swept aside, and the light fell upon him and enveloped him. He stepped into the room that was thus disclosed, and the curtain fell again into place. Facing him was a man as repellent as the dwelling in which he lived. He was a short man, and his beady eyes flashed venomously at the visitor. He attempted to smile, but his sensual lips curled into a sneer which mocked the attempt. He slowly lowered the flambeau in the sconce which he had held at arm's length to the table behind him, and he endeavored to pierce the veil which covered his visitor's face. The Duke of Venice raised the veil and moved forward. "Messer Duca," gasped the magician, and his face paled a trifle. "What is the cause for this honor, if I may so much as ask? Magnificent." The Duke sank into a chair and gazed meditatively at the wizard before him. "I have an enemy, Messer Gamani." He glanced meaningly at his host. "Ah, Excellency, poisons? Or perhaps a keen stiletto?" he answered, quick at comprehension. "No, neither will do. They avail me naught. I have used them. I have had my enemy set upon, but he turned and slaughtered my men and escaped without so much as a scratch. Diavolo, I have sent him wines diluted with the best of poisons, but they have gone into the canals of Venice. I have sent him a gorgeous gown saturated with a deadly poison, but he allowed a lackey to wear it and discovered my plan, for of course the lackey died. I have sent him an opal with the curse of hell upon it, but he ground it and returned it to me. But need I go on? I have come to you as a last resort. He must die. I see but one way, Excellency. Would you?" He stopped as if to reconsider, but resumed almost at once at the gesture of impatience manifested by his visitor. "Would you enlist the powers of darkness?" The Duke nodded silently and shrugged his shoulders eloquently. "You are aware, Messer Duca, that man must pay for consort with Satan." "I am aware. I care not for the consequences. It is a rash act, Magnificent." "It remains that my enemy must die," returned the Duke coldly. Messer Gamani shrugged his shoulders and spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "Since you are determined, Excellency, I am. Perchance you have a portrait of your enemy." The Duke cast something upon the table, and the magician's hand closed over it, and he peered at it intently. "It bears a strong resemblance to the Borgia. Cesare. It is not he, it is not a Borgia, much as it may seem." Messer Gamani remained silent. He moved to the fireplace and added fuel to the flames. "Care you to watch my preparation, Excellency? I shall have completed the first part of the task in the space of a glass of sand. If you care not, you may retire to my library and amuse yourself among my books." "That I shall do, Messer Gamani." A panel in the stone wall near the fireplace swung away, and the Duke passed into the wizard's library. The sands in the hourglass bled slowly to a heap, and as the last grains slipped through, Messer Gamani opened the panel in the wall and allowed the Duke to enter. The magician held a wax image in his hand, and he showed it to the Duke, who exclaimed sharply, "It resembles him, my enemy, Messer Gamani." "It was modelled from the miniature portrait. What do you propose to do with it?" "The image must be burned. It will take another glass of sand, but it cannot be hastened." "But when does my enemy succumb?" "As the flame from the wax dies, so your enemy dies." An expression of skepticism crossed the face of the Duke. "I very much doubt. Satan does not fail his followers, Magnificent." "It remains to be seen." He seated himself and watched the wizard ignite the taper of the wax figure. The incantations of the magician over it drew his attention for a space, and he watched the wax figure dwindle slowly before his eyes. The head was gone, the main body, and the flames sputtered over the legs of the fantastic little mould. As the flame expired over the wax remnants, Messer Gamani turned to the Duke. "He is dead, Excellency. At the hour, 7 glasses of sand, since the setting of the sun." The Duke threw a purse of ducats upon the table, but Messer Gamani made no move to take it. "Beware, Messer Gamani, if your efforts fail, if you have sported." He indicated the purse. "Take this gold. The gold is my pay, but there is more." "More gold? More pay? Satan must yet exact the penalty." The Duke was walking through the hall, the wizard at his heels. At the door they paused. "The devil may have a casket of gold," laughed the Duke, "if my enemy is dead." "Have you heard, Magnificent? The devil loves naught so much as a soul." His leering face vanished in the darkness, and the Duke relished the vision of the magician's squat head on the end of a pike pole as he picked his way back to where his gondola awaited him. He stepped from his gondola to the dock before his magnificent palace, and stood there a space watching the gondola recede in the distance. He looked up at the moon and wondered about his enemy. If he were not dead, the vision of the wizard's head on a pike pole would no longer be a vision but a reality. He was about to turn to ascend the steps to his palace when he heard the swishing of poles in the water. The gondola was coming at a swift rate, he judged. He did not err, for it hove into sight and came directly to the dock upon which he was standing. "Messer Duca," came a muffled voice from the gondola. The Duke started. He recognized the voice of his watch in the house of his enemy. "Ho, Messer Marquo. Come you from the residence of the Duke?" "So I do, and I must haste to return, for my absence will be suspected. I have great news. The Duke is dead." "Excellent." At the end of the 6th hour after sunset, he was seized with a most violent pain throughout his body. He screamed that he was burning, that he had been poisoned, but he had not been poisoned, for his food tasters still live unaffected. At the end of the 7th hour he succumbed in horrible pain, delivering a curse upon you. "It is well, Messer Marquo. You shall be rewarded amply for this. You have not been followed." "I trow not, Magnificent." "Then haste and return. It would not do to have someone suspect you as my envoy." The boat moved away, and the Duke exultantly leaped up the steps and into the palace. He ascended to his chamber, threw off his cloak and donned a luxurious gown. His enemy was dead. Now he would no longer be hampered in his nefarious designs by his enemy. His chief counselor must know. He would go to him now and inform him of the incident. The devil could come and take a casket of gold, 10 caskets for that matter, for his enemy was dead. He started down the stairway as swiftly as his burdensome robe would allow, but halfway down his gown tangled in his legs, and he tripped and fell headlong down the stone steps. A lackey found him next morning. He was dead. His neck was broken. End of The Devil's Pay by August W. Derleth. Bats, Belfry by August W. Derleth. Weird Tales, May 1926. The following letter was found among the papers of the late Sir Harry Everett Berkeley of Charing Cross, London, June 10th, 1925. My dear Mark, having received no answer to my card, I can only surmise that it did not reach you. I am writing from my summer home here on the moor, a very secluded place. I am fondling the hope that you will give me a pleasant surprise by dropping in on me soon, as you hinted you might. For this is just the kind of house that would intrigue you. It is very similar to the Baskerville home which Sir Arthur Conan Doyle describes in his Hound of the Baskervilles. Vague rumors have it that the place is the abode of evil spirits, which idea I promptly and emphatically pooh-poohed. You know that in the spiritual world I am but slightly interested, and that it is in wizardry that I delight. The thought that this quiet little building in the heart of England's peaceful moors should be the home of a multitude of evil spirits seems very foolish to me. However, the surroundings are exceedingly healthful, and the house itself is partly an antique, which arouses my interest in archaeology. So you see there is enough to divert my attention from these foolish rumors. Leon, my valet, is here with me, and so is old Mortimer. You remember Mortimer, who always prepared such excellent bachelor dinners for us. I have been here just 12 days, and I have explored this old house from cellar to garret. In the latter I brought to light an aged trunk, which I searched, and in which I found 9 old books, several of whose title pages were torn away. One of the books, which I took to the small garret window, I finally distinguished as Dracula by Bram Stoker, and this, I at once decided, was one of the first editions of the book ever printed. At the cessation of the first 3 days, a typical English fog descended with a vengeance upon the moor. At the first indication of this prank of the elements, which threatened completely to obscure the beautiful weather of the past, I had hauled out all the discoveries I had made in the garret of this building. Bram Stoker's Dracula I have already mentioned. There is also a book on the black art by de Rochas. 3 books, by Orfilo, Swedenborg, and Cagliostro, I have laid temporarily aside. Then there are also Strindberg's The Inferno, Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine, Poe's Eureka, and Flammarion's Atmosphere. You, my dear friend, may well imagine with what excitement these books filled me, for you know I am inclined towards sorcery. Orfilo, you know, was but a chemist and physiologist. Swedenborg and Strindberg, 2 who might be called mystics. Poe, whose Eureka did not aid me much in the path of witchcraft, nevertheless fascinated me, but the remaining 5 were as gold to me. Cagliostro, court magician of France, Madame Blavatsky, the priestess of Isis and of the occult doctrine, Dracula, with all its vampires, Flammarion's Atmosphere, with its diagnosis of the gods of peoples, and de Rochas, of whom all I can say is to quote from August Strindberg's The Inferno, the following. I do not excuse myself, and only ask the reader to remember this fact. In ease he should ever feel inclined to practice magic, especially those forms of it called wizardry, or more properly witchcraft, that its reality has been placed beyond all doubt by de Rochas. Truly, my friend, I wondered, for I had good reason to do so, what manner of man had resided here before my coming, who should be so fascinated by Poe, Orfilo, Strindberg, and de Rochas, 4 different types of authors. Fog or no fog, I determined to find out. There is not another dwelling near here, and the nearest source of information is a village some miles away. This is rather odd, for this moor does not seem an undesirable place for a summer home. I stored the books away, and after informing my valet of my intentions to walk some miles to the village, I started out. I had not gone far when Leon decided to accompany me, leaving Mortimer alone in the fog-surrounded house. Leon and I established very little in the town. After a conversation with one of the grocers in the village, the only communicative person that we accosted, we found that the man who had last occupied the house was a Baronet Lorville. It seemed that the people held the late baronet in awe, for they hesitated to speak of him. This grocer related a tale concerning the disappearance of 4 girls one dark night some years ago. Popular belief had, and still has it, that the baronet kidnapped them. This idea seems utterly ludicrous to me, for the superstitious villagers cannot substantiate their suspicions. By the way, this merchant also informed us that the Lorville home is called the Bat's Belfry. Personally, I can see no connection between the residence and the ascribed title, as I have not noticed any bats around during my sojourn here. My meditations on this matter were rudely interrupted by Mortimer, who complained of bats in the cellar, a rather queer coincidence. He said that he continually felt them brushing against his cheeks, and that he feared they would become entangled in his hair. Of course, Leon and I went down to look for them, but we could not see any of them. However, Leon stated that one struck him, which I doubt. It is just possible that sudden draughts of air may have been the cause of the delusions. This incident, Mark, was just the forerunner of the odd things that have been occurring since then. I am about to enumerate the most important of these incidents to you, and I hope you will be able to explain them. 3 days ago, activities started in earnest. At that date, Mortimer came to me and breathlessly informed me that no light could be kept in the cellar. Leon and I investigated, and found that under no circumstances could a lamp or match be kept lit in the cellar, just as Mortimer had said. My only explanation of this is that it is due to the air currents in the cellar, which seemed disturbed. It is true a flashlight could be kept alight, but even that seemed dimmed. I cannot attempt to explain the later fact. Yesterday, Leon, who is a devout Catholic, took a few drops from a flask of holy water, which he continually carries with him, and descended into the cellar with the firm intention of driving out, if there were therein ensconced any evil spirits. On the bottom of the steps I noticed, some time ago, a large stone tablet. As Leon came down the steps, a large drop of the blessed fluid fell on this tablet. The drop of water actually sizzled while Leon muttered some incantations, in the midst of which he suddenly stopped and fled precipitately, mumbling that the cellar was incontestably the very entrance to hell, guarded by the fiend incarnate himself. I confess to you, my dear Mark, that I was astounded at this remarkable occurrence. Last night, while the three of us sat together in the spacious drawing-room of this building, the lamp was blown out. I say blown out because there is no doubt that it was, and by some superhuman agency. There was not a breath of air stirring outside, yet I, who was sitting just across from the lamp, felt a cool draught. No one else noticed this draught. It was just as if someone directly opposite me had blown forcibly at the lamp, or as if the wing of a powerful bird had passed by it. There can be no doubt there is something radically wrong in this house, and I am determined to find out what it is, regardless of consequences. Here the letter terminates abruptly, as if it were to be completed at a later date. The two doctors bending over the body of Sir Harry Berkeley in Lawville Manor at last ceased their examinations. I cannot account for this astounding loss of blood, Dr. Mordaunt. Neither can I, Dr. Green. He is so devoid of blood that some supernatural agency must have kept him alive. He laughed lightly. About this loss of blood, I was figuring on internal hemorrhages as the cause, but there are absolutely no signs of anything of the sort. According to the expression of his features, which is too horrible for even me to gaze at, and me, he died from some terrible fear of something, or else he witnessed some horrifying scene. Most likely the latter. I think we had better pronounce death due to internal hemorrhage and apoplexy. I agree. Then we shall do so. The physicians bent over the open book on the table. Suddenly Dr. Green straightened up and his hand delved into his pocket and came out with a match. Here is a match, Dr. Mordaunt. Scratch it and apply the flame to that book and say nothing to anyone. It is for the best. Excerpts from the Journal of Sir Harry E. Berkeley, found beside his body in Lawville Manor on July 17, 1925. June 25. Last night I had a curious nightmare. I dreamed that I met a beautiful girl in the wood around my father's castle in Lancaster. Without knowing why, we embraced, our lips meeting and remaining in that position for at least half an hour. Queer dream, that. I must have had another nightmare of a different nature, although I cannot recall it, for upon looking in the mirror this morning, I found my face devoid of all color, rather drawn. Later, Leon has told me that he had a similar dream, and as he is a confirmed misogynist, I cannot interpret it. Strange that it should be so parallel to mine in every way. June 29. Mortimer came to me early this morning and said he would not stay another instant, for he had certainly seen a ghost last night. A handsome old man, he said. He seemed horrified that the old man had kissed him. He must have dreamed it. I persuaded him to stay on these grounds and solemnly told him to say nothing about it. Leon remarked that the dream had returned in every particular to him the preceding night, and that he was not feeling well. I advised him to see a doctor, but he roundly refused to do so. He said, referring to the horrible nightmare, as he termed it, that tonight he would sprinkle a few drops of holy water on himself, and that he stated would drive away any evil influence, if there were any, connected with his dreams. Strange that he should attribute everything to evil entities. Later, I made some inquiries today, and I find that the description of the Baronet Lorville fits to every detail the ghost of Mortimer's dream. I also learned that several small children disappeared from the countryside during the life of the last of the Lorvilles. Not that they should be connected, but it seems the ignorant people ascribe their vanishing to the Baronet. June 30th, Leon claims he did not have the dream, which, by the way, revisited me last night because of the potent effect of the holy water. July 1st, Mortimer has left. He says he cannot live in the same house with the devil. It seems he must have actually seen the ghost of old Lorville, although Leon scoffs at the idea. July 4th, I had the same dream again last night. I felt very ill this morning, but was able to dispel the feeling easily during the day. Leon has used all the holy water, but as tomorrow is Sunday, he will get some at the village parish when he attends Mass. July 5th, I tried to procure the services of another chef this morning in the village, but I am all at sea. No one in the town will enter the house, not even for £100 a week, they declare. I shall be forced to get along without one, or send to London. Leon experienced a misfortune today. Riding home after Mass, his holy water spilled almost all from the bottle, and later the bottle, containing the remainder of it, fell to the ground and broke. Leon, nonplussed, remarked that he would get another as soon as possible from the parish priest. July 6. Both of us had the dream again last night. I feel rather weak, and Leon does too. Leon went to a doctor, who asked him whether he had been cut or severely injured so as to cause a heavy loss of blood, or if he had suffered from internal hemorrhages. Leon said no, and the doctor prescribed raw onions and some other things for Leon to eat. Leon forgot his holy water. July 9th. The dream again. Leon had a different nightmare about an old man who, he said, bit him. I asked him to show me where the man had bitten him in his dream, and when he loosened his collar to show me, sure enough, there were 2 tiny punctures on his throat. He and I are both feeling miserably weak. July 15th. Leon left me today. I am firmly convinced that he went suddenly mad, for this morning he evinced an intense desire to invade the cellar again. He said that something seemed to draw him. I did not stop him, and some time later, as I was engrossed in a volume of Wells, he came shrieking up the cellar steps and dashed madly through the room in which I sat. I ran after him, and cornering him in his room, forcibly detained him. I asked for an explanation, and all he could do was moan over and over. "Mon Dieu, monsieur, leave this accursed place at once. Leave it. Monsieur, I beg of you. Le diable, le diable." At this he dashed away from me and ran at top speed from the house I after him. In the road I shouted after him, and all I could catch of the words wafted back to me by the wind were L'Ame, Le Diable, Mon Dieu, Tablet, Book of Thoth, all very significant words, Le Diable and Mon Dieu, the devil and my God. I paid little attention to, but Lames was a species of female vampire known intimately to a few select sorcerers only, and the Book of Thoth was the Egyptian book of magic. For a few minutes I entertained the rather wild fancy that the Book of Thoth was ensconced somewhere in this building, and as I racked my brains for a suitable connection between tablet and Book of Thoth, I at last became convinced that the book lay beneath the tablet at the foot of the cellar steps. I'm going down to investigate. July 16th, I have it. The Book of Thoth. It was below the stone tablet as I thought. The spirits guarding it evidently did not wish me to disturb its resting place, for they roused the air currents to a semblance of a gale while I worked to get the stone away. The book is secured by a heavy lock of antique pattern. I had the dream again last night, but in addition I could almost swear that I saw the ghosts of old Lorville and 4 beautiful girls. What a coincidence! I am very weak today, hardly able to walk around. There is no doubt that this house is infested not by bats, but by vampires. Lame. If I could only find their corpses, I would drive sharp stakes through them. Later, I made a new and shocking discovery today. I went down to the place where the tablet lay, and another rock below the cavity wherein the Book of Thoth had lain gave way below me, and I found myself in a vault with about a score of skeletons, all of little children. If this house is inhabited by vampires, it is only too obvious that these skeletons are those of their unfortunate victims. However, I firmly believe that there is another cavern somewhere below, wherein the bodies of the vampires are hidden. Later, I have been looking over the book by Derleth, and I have hit upon an excellent plan to discover the bodies of the vampires. I shall use the Book of Thoth to summon the vampires before me and force them to reveal the hiding place for their voluptuous bodies. Derleth says that it can be done. 9 o'clock. As the conditions are excellent at this time, I am going to start to summon the vampires. Someone is passing, and I hope he or she does not interrupt me in my work, or tell anyone in the town to look in here. The book, as I mentioned before, is secured by a heavy seal, and I had trouble to loosen it. At last I succeeded in breaking it, and I opened the book to find the place I need in my work of conjuring up the vampires. I found it, and I am beginning my incantations. The atmosphere in the room is changing slowly, and it is becoming intolerably dark. The air currents in the room are swirling angrily, and the lamp has gone out. I am confident that the vampires will appear soon. I am correct. There are some shades materializing in the room. They are becoming more distinct. There are 5 of them, 4 females and 1 male. Their features are very distinct. They are casting covert glances in my direction. Now they are glaring malevolently at me. Good God! I have forgotten to place myself in a magic circle, and I greatly fear the vampires will attack me. I am only too correct. They are moving in my direction. My God! But stay! They are halting. The old baronet is gazing at me with his glittering eyes fiery with hate. The 4 female vampires smile voluptuously upon me. Now, if ever, is my chance to break their evil spell. Prayer. But I cannot pray. I am forever banished from the sight of God for calling upon Satan to aid me. But even for that I cannot pray. I am hypnotized by the malefic leer disfiguring the countenance of the baronet. There is a sinister gleam in the eyes of the 4 beautiful ghouls. They glide toward me, arms outstretched. Their sinuous, obnoxious forms are before me, their crimson lips curved in a diabolically triumphant smile. I cannot bear to see the soft caress of their tongues on their red lips. I am resisting with all the power of my will, but what is one mere will against an infernal horde of ghouls? God! Their foul presence taints my very soul. The baronet is moving forward. His mordacious propinquity casts a reviling sensation of obscenity about me. If I cannot appeal to God, I must implore Satan to grant me time to construct the magic circle. I cannot tolerate their virulence. I endeavored to rise, but I could not do so. I am no longer master of my own will. The vampires are leering demoniacally at me. I am doomed to die, and yet to live forever in the ranks of the undead. Their faces are approaching closer to mine, and soon I shall sink into oblivion. But anything is better than this, to see the malignant undead around me. A sharp, stinging sensation in my throat. My God, it is. End of Bats Belfry by August W. Derleth. The Marmoset by Mark R. Shorer and August W. Derleth. Weird Tales, September 1926. The dark figure of a man slunk silently through the byways and alleys of Florence. He kept to the clutching shadows, avoiding the moonlight as much as possible. Once, when he unwittingly stepped into a bright patch of light, the rays of the moon gleamed brightly on something visible below the belt of his doublet. But he hastily drew back into the shadows and the gleam vanished. Once he halted and listened attentively because he thought he had heard a sound, but it was only a cat. Again, a bat swept by him in the darkness, and he shuddered, but it flew out in the moonlight and wheeled about in the calm summer air, casting a grotesque shadow upon the paving stones in the patch of light. He watched it, fascinated. A moth whirred out of its retreat into the moonlight, and before he quite grasped the rapidity of the thing, the man saw the bat sweep downward, and the moth was no longer there. He smiled in secret admiration of the feat. Like a bat, he would accomplish his object under the sheltering robe of night. He glanced eagerly down the street. A single, feebly illuminated window greeted his gaze, but it was a window in the house to which he was directed. He fumed impatiently and glanced up at the moon, which was already starting on its descent to the westward. For quite some time he stood there in the shadows. Messer Mari was late in retiring. But no matter, the watching man would attain his object, if wait he must until morning. The window was dark now, but he must bide his time and give the magician a space in which to fall into slumber. There was no doubt that it was Messer Mari who had bewitched his daughter, and now she was gone. His hand wandered to the hilt of his dagger, and he grasped the weapon to make certain that it was still firmly in its place. What was it he saw about the door of the magician's squat residence? He gazed intently at it. It was naught else but the figure of the wizard leaving the house and starting down the street. Messer Como watched the magician silently and wondered where he could be going. Suddenly he was seized with the idea of entering the house and secreting himself therein in Messer Mari's absence. He slunk forward again, and soon he was pushing at the door of the house. It yielded to his touch, and Messer Como entered. There was a patch of moonlight on the floor, and Messer Como searched for a hiding place. He noticed glowing embers in the grate, and wondered for what Messer Mari had needed a fire on such a warm night. Something shot across the patch of moonlight, and a second later, Messer Como felt it brushing against his legs. A cat, perhaps. He reached downward and struck the furry mass. At his action, the injured creature started to gibber demoniacally. It was gone now, and sat in the moonlight, shaking a tiny fist at Messer Como. It was a marmoset, and its big eyes caught and reflected the moonlight as it blinked them furiously at Messer Como. Messer Como went over to it and attempted to pacify it, but his efforts only served to increase the fury of the little beast. It gibbered incessantly, and Messer Como apprehensively wondered how quickly Messer Mari would return. For a minute he considered dispatching the animal, but then he thought better of it and drew back into the shadows, leaving the marmoset to itself. For a short space the creature remained silent, and Messer Como was about to breathe a sigh of relief when it again started to chatter, more vehemently than before. And at the same time, Messer Como heard a step resound in the court without. He half unloosed his dagger and felt his other weapon in the bosom of his doublet. The marmoset gibbered shrilly and jumped up and down on the stone floor in its anger. The door opened and Messer Mari entered. He halted at the threshold and stared at his pet. "Aha," said he, "something has disturbed my little pet. Is it not so, Shero?" He walked over to the candles in the bracket. "Perhaps," he continued, "perhaps we have a visitor." He removed a candle and walked over to the fireplace. "We shall see, Shero, in a space." He lit the candle at the embers and, without glancing about him, walked to the sconce and ignited the remaining flambeau. He turned, and his eyes fell upon Messer Como standing quietly near the entrance, his hand guiltily clutching the hilt of the dagger. The magician glanced at the marmoset. "You see, Shero, I was correct. We have a visitor." The animal blinked solemnly back at him, and at intervals it gibbered excitedly. Messer Mari continued, "Sit down, Messer Como, sit down. I am sure that your intentions are of the best, even though your hand rests upon your dagger. Possibly a habit, Messer Como, most possibly a habit. He turned to the animal on the floor again. It is most fortunate that he has come, eh, Chero? The creature moved forward and caught at Messer Mari's robe, and in a few seconds it was perched upon his shoulder. In a monotone, Messer Mari spoke a few words to his pet. The monkey jumped to the floor and raced over to Messer Como, and, almost before Messer Como was aware of it, the marmoset was running off with his dagger. But he contented himself with the thought that he still had another dagger in the form of a stiletto in the bosom of his doublet. The wizard addressed Messer Como. Yes, Messer Como, it is so fortunate that yon have come. I'm so in need of someone to aid me. It is kind of you. He smiled sardonically. Messer Como strove to answer, but he was totally unnerved by the calm of his would-be victim. Ah, yes, Messer Como. Today have I compounded 2 liquids, both poison. One should kill within the quarter hour, the other not for 2 months. I am very much in need of someone to test these for me, Messer Como. He smiled, but the glint in his eyes belied the smile. He continued, First, I think, we shall try the more deadly of the 2. He moved over to a shelf near the fireplace, from which he removed 2 phials. Meanwhile, Messer Como sat. He uttered not a sound, but stared at the magician, fascinated. All his plans of vengeance had dissolved into thin air, and his one thought was escape from this fiend who threatened his existence. He was seated near the open door, but Messer Mari's marmoset, which was between him and the door, was fingering the dagger it had stolen, and once in a space it glared evilly at Messer Como. Undoubtedly the animal could not kill, but even a scratch from the weapon would suffice to dispatch one, for Messer Como had taken the precaution to dip the end of the blade into a deadly compound. The window as a means of escape was too far distant. Dully he watched the wizard at his task of removing the phials. Messer Mari walked over and stood before him. He held aloft a phial and spoke. This, Messer Como, is the more deadly. The liquid was as colorless as the glass that contained it. A drop, Messer, or 2 drops will plunge yon into the most excruciating pains you can experience. While you will not be conscious of any exterior pain, you will nevertheless suffer most horribly. He uncorked the phial as he spoke. First, Messer Como, there will be a terrible burning feeling as the liquid travels down the gullet. But that, Messer, is naught compared to the gnawing pain in the vitals. 1,000 times you will wish yourself dead. 1,000 times you will regret that you had ever been born. Then, Messer, it will attack your brain in a most subtle manner. All you see will appear a bright glaring red, and suddenly you will go blind. He looked at Messer Como suggestively. Messer Como's forehead was covered with a cold sweat of terror. But, continued the wizard, if I should see that the poison is beginning to take effect, I shall possibly give you a few drops of a mixture which I have concocted to counteract its effect. Possibly, Messer. The ominous accent on the word possibly did not escape Messer Como's notice. And, Messer, if you but taste the other liquid, here he removed the stopper of the remaining phial, you will wish to be back in the tortures of the first poison. The first poison is merciful in comparison with the latter. For 2 whole months, Messer, you will live upon a rack. Everything you touch will seem like hot coal. Everything you eat will taste like putrefied flesh. But enough of my inadequate description. You shall see for yourself. Messer Como seemed to have shrunk in his clothes, for he sat immobile, staring at the marmoset that had defeated his purpose. The magician was advancing toward him, the phials containing the fatal poisons grasped firmly in his hands. But at that moment the wizard's pet leapt away from the door. With a hoarse cry, Messer Como flung himself into the court without. Calmly the magician poured the water in the phials out upon the flagstones at the threshold. He stood in the doorway and chuckled exultantly to himself, the marmoset clinging to his doublet, as he watched Messer Como run swiftly down the street. It was simple, he reflected, so simple to play upon this man's imagination. He had come to murder him, had he? The wizard laughed. Poison. He had none in his residence, for that very day the Duke de Medici had purchased his entire stock. He laughed again and stared after Messer Como, almost out of sight down the long street. But the fury of Messer Como was too much for him to contain, so he halted, half-turned, and saw the magician standing in the doorway. In the space of a second, Messer Como had formulated a plan. He left the center of the street and melted into the shadows on the side. He grasped the stiletto in his bosom. The blade of this tool had been poisoned. So Messer Mari would poison him, eh? Well, he would show him. He would give him a generous taste of his own medicine. Hidden by the shadows, he crept toward the magician's house. He was close enough now, he could easily reach the wizard with his weapon from where he stood. He drew his stiletto from his doublet, and raising his arm, threw it with all his strength, then turned and fled fleetly down the street. There was a brilliant flash in the moonlight, a shrill, piercing scream, and the magician crumpled to the flagstones before his house. For days afterward, people wondered at the significance of the cold body of the magician, with the stiff marmoset impaled to his breast by the long-bladed stiletto. End of the Marmoset, by Mark R. Schorer and August W. Derleth. The Philosopher's Stone, by August W. Derleth. Weird Tales, June 1928. A short tale of the Borgias. The lackey at the window inclined his head toward Messer Orsini, who sat fidgeting nervously at the high oaken table near the center of the room. "The three come, Excellency." Messer, the Duke Ercole de Orsini, turned and rose and walked swiftly to the window. The lackey pulled aside the heavy velvet hangings. 3 men were walking on the drawbridge of his castle. The Duke made a sign, the hangings dropped. "It is well. Admit them at once to this room." The lackey departed. Messer Orsini meditatively donned a mask, then seated himself to await the 3. He had not long to wait. The 3 came into the room, bowing servilely. "You have brought it," came from the masked Orsini. "We have, Messer." "Let me see it." One of the 3 men drew a long glass phial from his doublet. In the bottom of the glass gleamed a jewel. Messer Orsini repressed an exclamation. "The Philosopher's Stone, as you commanded, Messer." "Of what portent is the scroll above the stone?" "It is a formula of death, Messer." The Duke de Orsini threw a pouch of gold upon the table. One of the 3 seized it. The Duke spoke again. "There is to be no word of this in outer circles." "It shall be as you say, Messer. Our instructions were to warn you not to open the phial before the hour of midnight, 7 glasses of sand hence. They shall be obeyed. But carry back this warning. If the stone is not true, you die in company with your master. We are at your command, at your mercy, if the stone fails to perform its duty." The curtains swished behind the 3. At once Messer Orsini struck a gong. A lackey appeared. "Seize and bind the 3 men who are leaving my abode. Cast them into the dungeons until further word from me is received." The lackey disappeared. As if summoned by magic, another came to take his place. "Messer, a runner from Rome awaits your pleasure." "From Rome? Yes, Excellency." "Bring him to me." The lackey departed as silently as he had come. In a trice the runner stood before the Duke de Orsini. He bowed low. With a quick motion, he opened an amulet about his neck and drew from it a piece of folded paper, which he threw to the table before him. The Duke grasped it and read, "Be armed, prepare to attack the bull, your cousin." At once the Duke struck his gong, and as before a lackey appeared. "Ring the alarm bell." The lackey vanished, and the Duke turned again to the messenger. "You come from His Eminence?" Yes, Excellency. You are acquainted with the content of this message? No, Excellency. I was told to read it only in case of attack. You are from M.V. Cousin's household? Yes, Highness. It is well, you may go. Tonight you shall be housed with me, tomorrow you join my army. A lackey conducted the runner from the room. From outside came the insistent pealing of the alarum bell and the clatter of arms. The Duke's soldiers were assembling. Messer Orsini rose and moved across the room to the terrace. He stepped onto the balcony and addressed his men-at-arms. It is by command of His Eminence, the Cardinal Orsini, coupled with that of His Eminence, the Cardinal della Rovere, that you are to remain constantly in arms in preparation for an attack upon the Borgia, who moves now through this country. An attempt will be made in Rome tonight to poison the Borgia usurper on the papal throne. The men of our ally, the Duke di Colonna, are in readiness. The Milanese Sforzas have declared themselves neutral. As usual, the Doge of Venice remains neutral until such time as he sees who will win the victory. Then he will ally himself to the victorious standard. The Florentine de Medicis are willing to aid us, but not openly. All negotiations must be in secret. They are by no means in favor of our cause, but they live in constant fear of the Borgia bull. As one man, the soldiers inclined their heads. The Duke stepped back into the room and pulled the curtains across the window. Meditatively, he turned the hourglass. He sat down at his table and regarded the file containing the Philosopher's Stone. For a long time he sat there. A lackey came and lit the candles in their sconces and withdrew again, leaving the Duke alone. At length, the Duke di Orsini drew from a panel in the table a map of the surrounding country, and began to sketch the passage of Cesare Borgia's troops. He wondered how his cousin's envoy had managed to get through the Borgia's lines. He saw clearly that the envoy would have had to come through the enemy's lines to reach him. But abruptly, he dismissed the question and turned his attention to the attack he would make on the morrow. The last grains of sand of the 11th hour dribbled into a heap as Messer Orsini rose from the table with a file in his hand. He moved quickly beneath a sconce of candles, the better to see the precious stone, upon which the light glittered and sparkled. Almost feverishly, he broke the end of the file. He drew out the scroll, then turned the file upside down to catch the jewel with the palm of his outstretched hand. But though the jewel slid down the polished surface of the glass, it never reached the hand of the Duke Ercole di Orsini. For suddenly came a sharp pop, as if a glass bubble had been broken, and immediately afterward, a thin film of white dust rose like a vapor to the nostrils of the Duke. For a moment he stared in amazement at his dust-laden palm. Then he tore at the scroll, madly, as if in a frenzy. He opened it and read. His face twisted into an expression of horrible fear. He made as if to step forward. 2 steps he went, then fell flat on his face, the opened scroll beneath his palm. He twitched convulsively and lay still. The candles gleamed on the writing on the scroll, while from without came the sharp cries of a surprised army. The scroll read, "With the compliments of Cesare Borgia." End of The Philosopher's Stone by August W. Derleth. The Black Castle by Mark R. Schorer and August W. Derleth. Weird Tales, May 1927. A Tale of Astral Vengeance. The black castle high up on the cliff stood solitary and lone, silhouetted against the moon. By day the castle was prominent, but by night, in the full moonlight, it was much more so. It stood in relief. There were no trees, only a few shrubs that grew along the irregular sides of the mountain. To the fore the cliff was sheer, and topping this declivity, the ominous structure looked malefically down upon the little village of Chevaux. The village was completely enveloped in shadow, for the moon had not yet risen to a sufficient height to diminish the broad shadow of the mountain. Every soul in the peaceful village was in repose, under the pleasing mantle of darkness upon it. The village was like a picture by an artist, all in darkness save a few thin wisps of smoke, spiraling from several chimneys, and rising until they were caught in the light of the moon streaming down upon the plain from above the castle, then dispersing and vanishing into the crisp air. In sharp contrast to the calm of the exterior, a grim drama was being enacted within the castle. In a large room in one of the turrets of the chateau, the aged Count de Chevaux sat at a ponderous oaken table. The moon cast a patch of light upon the floor, which, aided by the flickering gleam of the flambeaux in their brackets on the table and the fitful light from the flames of the fire in the grate, served to light up a portion of the room. The room was almost bare. The walls, save for a coat of arms above the fireplace and a faded portrait of an ancient ancestor of the de Chevaux exactly opposite it, were devoid of ornamentation. The painted figure in the portrait gazed with great dignity at the coat of arms as if in approval. The floor, likewise, was bare of decoration. A few cumbersome chairs situated at the two entrances of the chamber gave the room an atmosphere of heaviness, of gloom. The firelight played upon a great skin stretched out upon the stone floor before the grate, and the gleaming teeth in the head of the pelt shone malevolently. The sputtering flambeau on the table disclosed the Count's pale features, and made evident the extreme agitation that held him in its grasp. His face twitched oddly and his hands trembled. He looked as if he was suffering from the palsy. He was writing, but not of his own volition, for his hand moved steadily and unhesitatingly across the parchment upon the table, while his glaring eyes were fixed with fierce intensity upon the lines of writing. There were no sounds in the room save the crackling of the flames in the grate, the scratching of the pen upon the parchment, and the occasional eerie sputtering of the flambeau. Suddenly the hand quavered and ceased its motion, and the Count seized the opportunity to reread what had been written. His throat became dry, and a violent trembling shook his body as he read the lines his hand had written. "Monsieur, I am here. I, Armand Champoy. I have come to speak to you tonight through my sole medium, your pen and hand. Does Monsieur remember me? My astral self gazes complacently down upon you. Perhaps, if Monsieur cannot recall my name, he can bring to mind an incident of 12 months ago, when he so calmly compelled me to dispose of my material self to favor his fortunes. Ah, Monsieur does. I perceive by his agitation. My widow suffers from the cold, Monsieur. My children starve, and I am helpless here. But you are, Monsieur. You cower about your lyre in company of that simple-minded son of yours. Ah, Monsieur, you live life. But then, I have naught to complain about. I am free and can taste no ills. It is because of my mortal widow and my suffering children, Monsieur, that I complain. I cannot help them, Monsieur, but I can avenge the wrongs you have done them. The wrongs, Monsieur, that you have done for gold. I can avenge innumerable sins committed for the sake of your fortunes. Does it seem foolish to you, Monsieur, that I should be writing this? That I, an astral, should threaten vengeance? But it should not, for those black blots, those books on sorcery on your shelves have taught you overmuch. Yet you may wonder how I can avenge the wrongs you have done, Monsieur, and I shall tell you. The hand started to move again, and the Count followed his pen with his eyes. It is simple, Monsieur, so simple. A rare experiment, Monsieur. Simply this. For a 12-month, I have been gathering knowledge upon varied subjects, and my field is unbounded. Your son, Monsieur, has been a resident of this gloomy castle since he can remember, and his brain is crude and his soul is unrefined. But I, Monsieur, I am strong, my mind excels in all, Monsieur, but I have no body. And also, Monsieur, I seek revenge. My abode is here by your side, Monsieur. My solution is this. Day by day, night by night, I will cast my superior power against your son's feeble will. I will drive out his astral body, his soul, monsieur, and I will enter and possess his body. Then, monsieur, I will kill you brutally, unhesitatingly, as you deserve." The writing ceased, and the Count could move his hand at his will. He stared at the mute evidence of the astral. Suddenly he rose, and with an angry snarl he eased the parchment from him into the hungry flames in the grate. He rubbed his hands across his eyes, futilely endeavoring to blot out the words that danced maliciously before him. He clasped his fists and glared angrily into the fire. Slowly he turned, walked toward the main corridor of the castle, and was swallowed up in the thick darkness. It was 2 weeks later. The young Count de Chevaux had acted strangely that day. His father had noticed this, and it impressed him. He pondered long upon it as he sat alone in his chamber. The more he tried not to think of the parchment which he had so vehemently thrown from him 2 weeks ago, the more he thought of it and associated it with his son's strange behavior. The astral of that champoy was getting in its fine work, mused de Chevaux. He could see no way to stop it. For once in his life the Count de Chevaux was helpless. The thought unnerved him. One day, some time later, the elder Count observed his son watching him covertly through half-closed eyes. He thought at once of Armand Champoy. His son was twirling a heavy walking stick, and he had been staring at his parent out of the corners of his eyes. The elder Count frowned heavily at his son, but the latter seemed not to notice. However, he removed his gaze and placidly continued to twirl his cane. The incident bothered the Count not a little, and soon he went to his library to consult his store of books on the black arts. The winter slipped by and spring came. The village of Chevaux was busy as a hive of bees. From the other side of the mountain, towering above the village, came the rushing, roaring sound of a great waterfall as it tumbled down the mountainside from crag to crag, from ledge to ledge, until it struck the plain with a great noise and went rushing off to water the fertile fields of the peasants. The birds were nesting, and the early spring flowers were beginning to force their way up through last year's leaves. The snowbanks were almost all gone. Only here and there on the sides of the mountain a few were visible, and they too were fast melting under the warm rays of the April sun. But inside the castle all was not so calm. The old Count was pacing to and fro in his library. He was uneasy, and he had good cause to be so. For his books of black magic could not aid him in the predicament in which he now found himself. A week ago his son had been taken ill. This was after a gradual decline. His illness could not be diagnosed. It seemed as if the patient was overcome by weariness, although he had never exerted himself to any harmful extent. For some time he lay in a coma, then suddenly he emerged and manifested a wish to rise. He had done so, healthier in mind and in body. At any other time it would have been a perfectly natural occurrence, but now the aged Count thought continually of Armand Champoy and his threat. His son did not seem the same to him. His actions were so strange, so alien, so utterly foreign to his nature. The elder Count de Chevaux was very perturbed over an incident that had occurred during the day. His son had removed a long-bladed stiletto from its rack in the library and had taken it to his chamber. The Count knew because he had watched him, had stealthily followed the youth, and observed his every action. That night a storm broke over the castle, shattering the placidity of the little village of Chevaux, and for the first time the elements were in agreement with the life within the castle. The aged Count's mind was in a turmoil, but one thought stood out above the agitated throng. His son was about to kill him. Of that he was sure. That Champoy had succeeded in his evil purpose of possessing the body of his son during his recent illness. And he was brooding on the dreadful course that presented itself to him as his only alternative. At length he came to a conclusion, and with guilty steps he withdrew from the room. A flash of lightning revealed him stepping through the doorway, and his hand clutched a stiletto, the companion of the one his son had concealed in his chamber. He groped his way up the stone stairway, and with each step his purpose became firmer. He would fool that Champoy, thwart him at his vengeance. At his son's doorway he paused and clutched the weapon a little tighter. He listened for sounds, but he heard nothing save the regular breathing of his son within. He pushed the door before him and slipped quietly into the room where his son slept. The Count emerged from the doorway, and his hand was empty. Silently he trod down the stone steps, and quietly he resumed his seat in the library. The storm was becoming more violent with the passing of the hours. Idly he picked up the quill before him and toyed with it. He'd thwarted Champoy at his own purpose. He smiled exultantly. But these thoughts were rudely interrupted, and his hopes were shattered, for suddenly he felt his fingers tighten on the pen, and involuntarily his hand moved toward a piece of parchment before him. "So, monsieur, you think you have thwarted me. Your imagination plays you pretty tricks. You have killed your son because of them. I, monsieur, have never left the ether, and yet I have my vengeance. But, monsieur, if you think for one moment that you have escaped your death tonight, you delude yourself, for die tonight you will." The Count stared at what had been written, and a cold perspiration broke out upon his forehead. Outside, the storm raged furiously. The Count tore the parchment into pieces and scattered them upon the floor. He ran to the window and shook his fist at the sky and cursed the God who had made him. And, as if in answer to that curse, the clouds parted and a streak of lightning reached out toward him. From the village below, the people saw the lightning strike the castle. They saw a turret crumble to ruins and come crashing down the steep cliff to the plain, and heard a terrible cry echo and re-echo through the night. And some affirm to this day that they heard very distinctly a mocking laugh carried along by the wind above the roar of the gale. End of The Black Castle by Mark R. Shora and August W. Derleth. The Sleepers by August W. Derleth. Weird Tales, December 1927. A short ghost story. "That story," began the man with the gold spectacles, crossing his legs, "reminds me of an odd incident that befell me just last year." The other three men moved closer around the fireplace and looked over at him expectantly. The man with the gold spectacles repeated his statement. Unnoticed by them, a thin little man clad in a blue suit with brass buttons slid onto the fifth seat, somewhat back in the shadows. The inquisitive flames in the fireplace leaped higher to light up the face of the newcomer, but the effort was too much for them, and they sank back exhausted. The four men did not see him. It was last summer. I was at the time in Hollywood working with the director of my latest book, which was being filmed, when my publisher in Chicago wired me to come to him at once. The matter was urgent, he stated. Somewhat testily, I wired back that I would come immediately. The train I took was the Midnight Express. When I called for my ticket, every Pullman was filled to capacity. Certainly, thought I am not going to be cheated out of a night's rest merely because the Pullman cars are all filled to capacity. So I clamored loudly for a Pullman. I was not alone in my demand, for a pompous salesman who had purchased his ticket after I had procured mine added his voice to mine. At length another Pullman was added. Had it not been for the hullabaloo the salesman and I raised, the incident I am about to relate would never have happened. It being shortly after midnight, I wanted to retire. I left the salesman smoking out on the rear platform of our car, and I went into the extra Pullman. My berth was lower 7, and I went directly over to that number and pulled the curtains aside. But I shut them again as quickly as I'd opened them. For a man lay in my berth, sleeping peacefully. I was indignant that the officials should cause such an error. I called for the porter, who came in as fast as his sleeping feet would carry him. Said I, when the black had come abreast of me, "Sam, there's a man in my berth." He grinned foolishly and pulled the curtains slightly aside. "Indeed, sir, indeed there is. Very unfortunate, sir, and Taza Fak. Sam, I answered, go and get me the Pullman conductor, and don't you dare to come back without him. Indeed I will, sir. After what seemed a wholly unnecessary interval, Sam returned with the Pullman conductor. When the conductor stepped into the car, he asked, "Are you McCarthy?" "Yes," said I, "I'm McCarthy." "H.P. McCarthy?" "Yes," said I again, "H.P. McCarthy." He came up to me. "Sam tells me that you claim that your berth is occupied." Lower 7 was assigned to H.P. McCarthy and to no one else. As a matter of fact, there are only 2 people in this extra car, you and a salesman, C.E. Schweers. "Is that right?" said I. It annoyed me that the conductor took so much for granted. He had never even peeped into the berth, and already he was turning to go. "Just a minute. Mr. Schweers is out on the platform. Mr. McCarthy is right here, yours truly, and I say that there's a man in lower 7. And I pulled aside the curtain, and the conductor looked in and saw the man there. It wounded his pride to find that he was wrong, and so he called loudly to the sleeping man. But the man didn't move. So he went over to him and reached his hand in to shake the sleeper. Now I couldn't see what happened, but I was staring right into the conductor's face, and I saw his expression change so rapidly that I thought he was going to faint. His face went white altogether. He pulled his hand out quickly, as if he had been touching a hot iron, and then he pushed the curtains wide apart to admit as much light as possible. Then he looked in again. All the time, I could see the man lying there in the light admitted by the widely opened curtains. I said nothing. He turned to me and pointed at the sleeper. "McCarthy, reach in there and touch him." I thought it was an odd request, but I did it, and I'll wager any amount that my face went as white as his did. For I swear that I saw that man there with the coverlet turned back at his shoulders. I saw that. But my hand felt the undisturbed smoothness of the coverlet, and as I looked, my hand went straight through the man. Sam left by one door as Mr. Schweers came in by the other. The conductor and I stood in the aisle staring stupidly at the sleeper in my berth. A smothered exclamation from Schweers caused us to turn to him. He stood before berth 3, the lower, staring at something. We knew what he would say before he said it. "There's a man in my berth." The conductor stared at him. I stared at him. He turned to the conductor. "Well, what are you going to do about it? I'm not paying for a filled berth." "Feel him," the conductor stammered. "Yes," said I, "feel him." He looked oddly at us, but obediently he reached in to feel him, and shortly there were 3 white-faced people in the aisle of the extra Pullman, all staring stupidly at a man sleeping in the berth of a Pullman car. "By God," said the conductor with effort, "there's some mystery in this," a fact which had not escaped the notice of any of us. He moved resolutely to berth 6 and pulled aside the curtains. And there lay a woman, sleeping, and again, what we saw, we could not feel. And the 3 of us made the rounds, and every berth, upper and lower, was occupied by a man, woman, or child. And we came back to berth 7, and stood there staring at the sleeper. And while we stood there, the door opened at the end of the car, and a thin little man who wore a conductor's blue suit with brass buttons walked in and looked nervously around. He had the attitude as of being summoned and looking for whoever had summoned him. Not so, Mr. McCarthy. The conductor had a premonition that all was not well, and he came into the Pullman to justify or destroy that premonition. It was the little man, the newcomer, who had spoken, but no one seemed to have heard him. "But we didn't stare very much longer," continued the man with the gold spectacles, "for suddenly the thin little conductor that had entered vanished in the side of the Pullman car, and when we turned back to look at the sleepers, we saw only the unrumpled spreads on our beds. Immediately the conductor rushed out onto the rear platform. Mr. Schweers and I followed him. We were going round the famous horseshoe curve. The country was all radiant in the bright moonlight. The conductor turned to us. Do either of you know what happened here at this spot 1 year ago today? No, said Schweers. I can't think of anything. I, too, was forced to shake my head. What? Returned the conductor. Have both of you forgotten the famous Midnight Express wreck of last August 7th? Of course we hadn't. It happened on that spot, just a little way back there in the moonlight, on a night just like this. 77 people died in that wreck. This car is one that was salvaged from the wreckage and was rebuilt. This is its first trip in its rebuilt form. But the people in the berths? Interrupted Schweers. Yes, those people in the berths. You notice they all disappeared on the spot of the accident, didn't they? Well, figure it out for yourselves, gentlemen. And with that he went back to his post. And that's what I say to you, gentlemen. Figure it all out for yourselves. Were those sleepers or weren't they? For my part, I am convinced. There was a meditative silence. Then the man with the gold spectacles spoke again. By the way, didn't one of you gentlemen say something about a premonition the phantom conductor had? I thought someone said something about it, but as I recollect the accident, the conductor was killed at once, so you couldn't possibly know how he felt before the accident. Didn't anyone say something? And all of the men turned to the fifth chair, upon which the thin little man in the faded blue conductor's suit with brass buttons had been sitting. There was no answer, and the firelight flickered on the bolt of the locked door. End of The Sleepers by August W. Derleth. The Tenant at number 7 by August W. Derleth. Weird Tales, November 1928. A short ghost story. Mr. John Padden got onto the car at Charing Cross Station and settled himself for a long ride into the northern part of the city. Mr. Padden was an antiquary, and he had only just now closed his shop, having had to keep open much longer than usual to satisfy the whim of a late customer, who had, after all, bought scantily. A small, mean-looking man, Mr. Padden reflected, who had begged him to sell him the grotesque medallion at a lower price than the tag called for. Mr. Padden's thoughts revolved about the man, and from him moved very naturally to the Roman medallion, found, it was said, at York. Mr. Padden had his doubts, for he was inclined to regard all antiques with a dubious eye, but after all, it was not really his business whether they were antiques or not. It was not often that Mr. Padden took a late underground. When he thought of how late he would get home, he made a grimace of annoyance. At the same moment he looked up and came face to face with his late customer. Mr. Padden wondered whether he should nod. The customer, however, made no sign of recognition. The man was decidedly mean-looking, Mr. Padden observed uneasily. Almost unconsciously he began to wish that he had sold him the medallion, even at the risk of a blight loss. He resolved to keep a careful eye on the man. However, it was soon evident that the customer either did not remember Mr. Padden or did not wish to do so. Mr. Padden's apprehension left him, and he began to scrutinize the man. He smiled discreetly at the beaver hat and the old-fashioned square spectacles, and followed the heavy black muffler from the man's throat to where it stuck out below his shabby jacket. The face above the muffler looked very old, but the thin lips were arm, and the tuft of grizzled hair on the chin was not totally white. The small eyes behind the spectacles were black. The nose was sharply aquiline, and Mr. Padden found himself wondering how the man would look if it were slightly curved. Quite suddenly, the man looked up and stared fully at Mr. Padden. The antiquary immediately buried his head in the Times. In a moment he looked cautiously over the top of the paper and found his late customer still regarding him thoughtfully. Mr. Padden bent again to his paper, nor did he look up again until the motorman called out his station. Mr. Padden discovered that his late customer was also leaving the underground at St. John's Wood Road. At once his apprehension seized Mr. Padden again. He decided hurriedly that if the man should come back to the shop on the following day, he should have the medallion at his price, But when Mr. Paddon stepped from the ear, he was alone. There was no one about. For a moment the antiquary entertained the idea that the man was about to ambush him, but he immediately dismissed it as absurd and walked home. The following day was foggy. The air was uncomfortably heavy, and drops of water came out of the yellow and grey mist and struck Mr. Paddon as he walked swiftly from the station to his antique shop. He entered his shop with a sigh of relief and closed the door hastily to shut out the fog that billowed inward. He drew off his gloves and put them, together with his cane, on the counter. His greatcoat and hat he hung on a convenient suit of armour near the door. Then he settled himself on a stool behind the counter, put on his spectacles, and assumed an air of great importance. Hardly had he done so when he discovered, not 3 feet from him, the customer of the night before. Mr. Paddon stared at him for a moment, as if unable to comprehend his appearance. It was almost as if he had materialized from the suit of armour near the door, toward which Mr. Paddon involuntarily looked. Mr. Paddon had not heard the door open. With a half-apologetic smile, the antiquary returned his attention to his customer. "Well, sir," he began, "I suppose you've earmarked that medallion. If I could have it for £5, sir, I'd take it." The man's face did not change. He stared steadily at Mr. Paddon. "Well, sir, I'd about decided last night that you could have it at £5, though it's a sacrifice, sir, and I'll never do it again." The customer's expression did not change. "But," continued Mr. Paddon, somewhat flustered, "I don't suppose I'd ever have the chance to sell it again for some time, so it's just as well that it goes. By the way, what is your name?" "Gaunt. Benjamin Gaunt." "And address?" 7 St. John's Wood Terrace. "It's just in case of something turning up regarding it. You can't ever tell in this business. It's always better to have a record." Mr. Paddon placed the medallion on the counter and reached for paper in which to wrap it. The customer reached for the medallion. "You needn't wrap it. I'll take it just this way." "As you please, sir." Mr. Paddon smiled. The customer nodded curtly and deposited several coins upon the counter. Then he turned and walked quickly to the door. Mr. Paddon took up the coins. The door closed softly. Mr. Paddon stopped in the act of depositing the coins in the register to look at them more closely. They were coins of Queen Victoria. He glanced to where Mr. Gaunt had rested against the counter. There were no marks there, nothing at all to indicate that Mr. Gaunt's clothing had been dampened by the London mists. The door of Mr. Paddon's antique shop opened to admit a middle-aged man, who entered with a great bustle and noise, and almost knocked Mr. Paddon's walking stick from the suit of armour. From a pocket of his greatcoat he took a catalogue, which Mr. Paddon recognized as one that he had sent out some days before. Mr. Paddon eyed his customer over his spectacles and fixed a benevolent stare on his visitor's chubby red cheeks. "Mr. Paddon," the customer began, "I'm James Conroyd. You've got my name on your mailing list. Some days ago you sent out a catalogue in which you describe a Roman medallion, the particular medallion that I've been searching for half my life. I've good reason to believe that it's the very medallion I lost years ago. Where did you get hold of it, by the way?" "Why, I haven't any idea, Mr. Conroyd. Perhaps I could look it up, but it's pretty hard to keep account." "Never mind. Let me see it, will you?" "I'm sorry," said Mr. Paddon, looking rather futile, "but I sold it not 10 minutes ago." Mr. Conroyd opened his eyes wide. "You sold it? To whom, if I may ask?" "To a Mr. Benjamin Gaunt." "Why, that's the man I bought it from. The only other man who was looking for the medallion gets here before I do. You see, Mr. Paddon, some years ago, when I was little more than a kid, I bought the thing from Gaunt for £5. That's what I sold it to him for. That's a coincidence. After I'd bought it from him, he was continually pestering me to sell it back to him. I never would have sold it to him. But one day I lost it." Suddenly Mr. Conroyd's face underwent a change. He stared at Mr. Paddon, who smiled respectfully. Then suddenly his face flushed angrily. "Say, listen! I don't know what your idea is, but you faked this fellow's name. Benjamin Gaunt died 5 years ago." Mr. Paddon looked his dismay. He felt suddenly horribly useless, and hastened to assure Mr. Conroyd that he had sold the medallion to Mr. Benjamin Gaunt. "No, Mr. Conroyd. I sold it to a man who gave me that name." "Did he give you his address?" asked Mr. Conroyd, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Yes. It's 7 St. John's Wood Terrace. Could you go out there with me, Mr. Paddon? I'm bound to have that medallion no matter what I pay for it." "Well?" "I'll pay you for your time." Mr. Paddon looked dubiously at the fog outside, then back at his eager visitor. "Yes," he said. "I'll go." 7 St. John's Wood Terrace was not difficult to find. Everyone seemed to know of it, and when the antiquary and his customer asked about it, they were treated to curious stares and, in some cases, discreet smiles. 7 St. John's Wood Terrace was a deserted house in its last stages. Not a window pane remained in the ramshackle structure, and there were no doors. The shingles were green with moss, and the chimney had crumbled long before. There was no longer a discernible path leading to the door. "Well," said Mr. Paddon, "should we go in? I suppose we might as well, seeing we've come this far." The two men hesitated a moment, and looked about them and back at the house, before they walked slowly up to the structure. They entered. Their footprints broke into the dust of years as they went from room to room. In a little chamber in the back of the house, Mr. Conroyd found the Roman medallion. On the table were marks disturbing the dust, where the medallion had been thrown. In one corner of the room lay an old beaver hat, damaged beyond repair. There were no footprints in the room, nor could the men find where the medallion had entered. "Certainly Benjamin Gaunt's," said Mr. Conroyd, picking up the hat. Quite near the table, covered with dust, Mr. Paddon noticed a black muffler. Some distance away lay all that was left of a pair of square spectacles. End of The Tenant at number 7 by August Derleth. The Turret Room by August Derleth. Weird Tales. September 1927. The Adventure of the Pipe. Lord Alving stopped in the act of lighting his cheroot. He turned slowly toward the Earl of Kent, loudly addressing a small group about him. He smiled quizzically and spoke. "I say, old fellow," said Lord Alving, "are you quite certain of the element of truth in everything you say?" The conversation stopped, automatically it seemed. The Earl of Kent raised his eyebrows in a mock-serious gesture. Lord Alving remained smiling, the unlighted cheroot in his hand. "For instance, what, Alving?" "The exact words were these, I believe: ghosts, balderdash, poppycock." He paused. "You said that, didn't you?" "Yes, I believe I did." "And you meant it?" "Of course, Alving." The ladies had stopped bridge and stood about in a small circle. Lady Montrose idly stirred a cup of tea. Lady Alving had come away from her table with a royal flush in her hand. The Duke of Gloucester stood looking at it in the small silence. "You believe every word of it too, old man?" "Yes, I do." "Then let me tell you something that happened to me about 7 years ago down at the Duke of Gloucester's castle. There was rather an excellent crowd. Trust the Duke to make a pleasing selection. We were gathered about the dinner table one evening, and somehow we began to talk about the supernatural. We were rather amused at some of the theories of our lodge, of Lombroso, and of Flammarion. The Duke didn't say much, he just sat and listened. Nor did he say anything until conversation began to lag. Then suddenly he said, "It may interest you to know that the turret room of the centre tower of my castle is supposed to be haunted." "Not really," chorused several of us. But he was perfectly serious. I've never seen him more so. Several of the company turned to the Duke of Gloucester. His calm smile verified Lord Alving's statement. "Do you mean to say," said I, "that if I'd spend a night in the turret room, I'd see a ghost?" "I see no reason why you shouldn't," he replied immediately. Without hesitation, I said, "I'll spend tonight there. It'll take an unusual manifestation to scare me out." The Duke protested, but I persisted. At length he gave in. I wanted to be shown right up. I could hardly wait. On the stairs I turned and shouted down, "If I see a ghost, you will all hear about it." "And if you don't," came from someone below. "All of you remember Harry Longworth, the poet, don't you?" I was sure that you did. Harry was there, and Harry shouted back, "And if you don't, I'll send one up to you." Everybody laughed, and I followed the servant up to the haunted room. There was nothing conspicuous about the room, except perhaps the dust. The room had never been used. The mere thought of a spectre will scare people away very easily, it seems. The moonlight streamed in through the latticed windows. I brushed the dust from one of the antique chairs and sat down. All of you know that the Duke tolls the hours with his ancient alarum bell. I had come into the turret room as the bell tolled 10 o'clock. I sat patiently waiting for some supernatural manifestation until somewhat after 12. I was disappointed, very much so. I had almost expected to see some long-dead cavaliers fight a duel before my eyes, or some atrocious murder committed. I allowed myself to go to sleep. The alarum bell was tolling 2 when I woke up. I had a queer feeling. I knew that there was someone else in the room. The patch of moonlight had moved considerably. It now fell aslant the dust-covered bed. On the edge of the bed, in the moonlight, sat Harry, grinning foolishly. I had completely forgotten him. "Sap," said I, "do you want to scare me to death?" He kept right on grinning. "Lucky you came up, though," I continued. "It was becoming odiously monotonous up here." He nodded a little and grinned some more. "Haven't got a deck of cards with you, have you?" I asked. He shook his head. I walked over to the window and looked out. There was a beautiful view. "Fine view, Harry, come here." But he didn't come, and when I turned around he had gone. I supposed he had gone for a deck of cards, and I waited accordingly. He didn't come back. In the morning, I told the Duke what I thought of his haunted room. I told him that all I had seen was Harry. He looked as if you could have knocked him over with a feather. He's not so small either. Lord Alving slowly lit the cheroot he had been holding. "And what does that make of my idea of ghosts, Alving?" asked the Earl of Kent, smiling. "Where does the ghost part come in?" asked the Duchess of York. "Yes," said Lady Montrose. "Where is the ghost?" "It doesn't prove anything to me, Alving," said the Earl of Kent. "No? It didn't to me either, until the Duke of Gloucester told me that Harry had died between 1 and 2 that morning of a sudden stroke of apoplexy." End of The Turret Room by August W. Derleth. A Dinner at Imola by August W. Derleth. Weird Tales. April 1929. A Tale of Cesare Borgia. Messer Niccolo Machiavelli had just signed his name to a letter to the Ten when the flap of his tent swung wide in the hand of a lackey, permitting His Highness, the Prince Cesare Borgia, to enter. "Ah, Excellency!" Machiavelli half turned. "Another letter to the Ten, Messer Machiavelli?" Cesare Borgia shrugged his shoulders. "You keep them well informed as to my movements." Niccolo Machiavelli made a deprecating gesture. The Borgia prince smiled. "You had best warn them against guile in their dealings with me, Messer Machiavelli. Florence holds no interest for me, but let them once deceive me, and the Medici rule no longer." Messer Machiavelli bowed his head. "Florence has no intention, Highness, of going against your wishes. Indeed, she is most anxious to preserve your friendship. That will remain as it is, Messer Machiavelli. For the present I have come to ask you to dine with my company on the 3rd night hence. The dinner is in honor of the young Duke Paolo di Colonna." Messer Machiavelli started. He looked at his host with raised eyebrows. Only yesterday his trusted lackey had informed him of the rumor of a plot against the Borgias, the headquarters of which were in Rome, at the palaces of the Cardinals Orsini and della Rovere. It was rumored, too, that the young Paolo di Colonna was in alliance with this secret revolt, and that he was furthering the cause by sowing the seeds of revolt among the troops in camp at Imola, while at the same time the Duke Giovanni di Orsini was seeking to stir up the Borgia soldiers at Forli. As yet, Machiavelli had no knowledge that the prince knew of the affair. Messer Machiavelli nodded his head. "You honor me," he murmured. "You will come?" "With pleasure." "Very well. We will meet at table if not before." The prince signaled to his lackey, who raised the tent flap for his master to take leave of the Florentine envoy. But hardly had the Borgia prince left the tent than Machiavelli gave a quick, short call. "Giulio!" From somewhere in the rear of the tent a small, stooped figure arose and stood before Niccolò Machiavelli. "You called me, Messer Machiavelli?" "You heard the Borgia?" The figure nodded. "It is well. You will follow him continually until the third night hence." The lackey laughed silently. He nodded. "At the third night, report here before dinner." The lackey nodded quickly again, and without a word vanished into the interior of the tent, to emerge in the gathering darkness at its back within the minute. Messer Niccolò Machiavelli yawned, and gazed speculatively at the hourglass on his table. At the hour before dinner on the third night, Messer Machiavelli was startled out of his reverie by the sudden appearance of his lackey Giulio. "He visited at Luigi Reni's," said Giulio abruptly. "And this Reni?" queried Machiavelli with arched brows. "Is a magician," answered Giulio suggestively. "Ah, and what did the Borgia there?" "He brought with him, and left at Reni's, a small portrait of the Duke Paolo di Colonna. That was yesterday. Today he went again, and the portrait was returned to him, together with a large package. This package contained, I have made certain, numerous curiously wrought candles for the table tonight. That is all. Other than that is of no account. The Borgia prince attended to the usual matters of his troops." Messer Machiavelli toyed with a quill on his table. "What make you of the candles, Giulio?" he asked. The lackey smiled suggestively. He hunched his shoulders and spread his hands in an empty gesture. "Who knows?" he said. "The Borgia takes a portrait of his enemy to a magician, and receives at its return a packet of wax candles. It is said that if one burns a wax effigy of one's foe, made according to certain secret formulas, or if one pierces it to the heart, the model dies." Messer Machiavelli pondered a space. "How many figures are needed? How many must be burned to rid oneself of an enemy?" "But one, Excellency. But Cesare is a true Borgia. His resources know no end." Messer Machiavelli nodded. "It is good work, Giulio. I shall not forget it." The lackey bowed and vanished in the shadows at the rear of the tent. Messer Machiavelli rose and donned a great cloak. He raised the flap of his tent and looked out at the cloudless sky. Far away, on the horizon toward the east, the full moon was just rising above the hills, and from the marshlands to the west thin wisps of vapor were moving toward the camp. Messer Machiavelli glanced dubiously at the hourglass on the table, saw that the sand had passed the half hour, and slipped out of his tent. At the banquet hall, the young Paolo di Colonna was the center of a boisterous crowd. Cesare Borgia stood some distance away from him, and was the first to greet the Florentine envoy at his arrival. Messer Machiavelli sought vainly for some trace, some premonition on the inscrutable face of his host. There was naught save a sardonic smile. Messer Machiavelli was uneasy. He bethought himself of the pending alliance between the Council of Ten and di Colonna. He resolved to keep a watchful eye on the Borgia ring, which he knew served as a container for the white powder that Cesare had once shown him. He had often been told that for the Borgia prince to open this ring meant instant death for someone. Messer Machiavelli moved somewhat closer to the table, the better to observe what Cesare Borgia was occupied with. He gave an involuntary start when he noticed that the prince himself was distributing before the places at table the carven candles that he had received from the magician, Rennie. He sought out the place reserved for the prince and found it quickly by the banner of the bull draped over the back of the chair. Directly opposite this chair stood one marked with the arms of Di Colonna. Messer Machiavelli's eyes strayed unconsciously to the wax figure before his own plate, set at the arms of the Medici. The figure was merely a replica of a trooper, and so, Messer Machiavelli saw, were many of the others. Some were copies of kings or princes, others of dukes or barons. As his eyes stole down the line of figures, Messer Machiavelli found himself curiously attracted by one, slightly larger than the rest. That bore a suspicious resemblance to someone he knew. He looked at the chair. It was the chair of Paolo di Colonna, and the figure was an exact replica of the young duke. The strident voice of Cesare Borgia interrupted Messer Machiavelli's thoughts, calling him to table. Some of the young officers were already seated. Smiling inwardly, Machiavelli noticed that the Duke Paolo di Colonna had brought his taster with him. So, he saw, had several of the noblemen who were known to be in sympathy with Borgia enemies. The dinner progressed smoothly, much too smoothly, Messer Machiavelli thought. Cesare Borgia, as host, discoursed volubly on many subjects, and he did not lack those to argue with him. During the entire meal, the prince had not once touched his ring. Now, toward the end of the meal, the prince indicated by example that his guests were to light the candles at their plates with tapers that had been furnished. Hardly had this been done than, to the amazement of all present, Cesare Borgia abruptly changed the conversation. "It is generally known, I believe, that there is a conspiracy now stirring in Rome." The prince looked casually over at the Duke Paolo di Colonna. The Duke paled. "Its leaders have been determined, and unless all plans are immediately surrendered to the papal government, they and their estates will be seized and confiscated by His Holiness, Alexander VI. The Cardinals Orsini and Della Rovere are heading this move, and there is talk of allying the rebellious Colonna faction." The prince was interrupted by a hoarse scream from the Duke Paolo di Colonna, who had half risen from his chair and was clawing at his collar. "I am burning," he shrieked, and fell toward the table. A lackey hastily ran to aid him, and in a loud voice, Cesare Borgia summoned his physician. Then he crossed around the table and supported the young duke until the doctor came. When at last he entered, the prince gave an order for the duke's removal to his own chamber, aiding the physician and 2 lackeys to carry the duke to the door of the hall. Cesare Borgia returned to the table, outwardly calm. All about him hummed excited whispers. Many of the soldiers looked questioningly at the duke's taster standing unharmed behind the empty chair. The prince reopened the conversation and continued to speak until he saw that the flame of Di Colonna's candle had burned out. Then he stopped abruptly, and Messer Machiavelli caught him glancing toward the door. At the same moment, the curtains at the end of the hall were thrust aside, and the prince's physician ran into the room. He bowed and spoke. "Highness," he said simply, "the Duke Paolo di Colonna is dead of an unknown illness." The prince nodded his head and opened his lips. "It is unfortunate, but as God wills, so shall it be." Without further comment, he again opened the subject of the Orsini conspiracy. End of A Dinner at Imola by August W. Derleth. The Elixir of Life by Mark R. Schorer and August W. Derleth. Weird Tales, July 1926. The swinging lantern at the farther end of the narrow street approached closer and closer the house of Messer Girolami, the magician. The lackey who carried the bobbing light walked swiftly, spurred on by the mutterings of the hooded figure behind him. The night was lighted by the silver moon hanging in the sky, yet but a single moonbeam penetrated the darkness of the straight alley. Messer Girolami sat alone in the heavily curtained room, which he chose to call his laboratorium. The multicolored liquids in the numerous phials about the room were in odd contrast to the black curtains on all sides. On the oaken table, well toward the center of the room, stood 3 large retorts, 2 of them partly filled with a colorless fluid. The only light in the room was that thrown by the fitful fire from which the hungry flames leaped upward and licked the pot suspended from a tripod above them. The weird shadows danced grotesquely on the black draperies. Messer Girolami's shadow, too, was grotesque, for his long nose and straggly beard made it look for all the world like that of Mephistopheles. Messer Girolami's gaze was fixed upon the hourglass on the shelf above the fireplace. He watched the grains of sand trickle slowly downward, half eagerly, half apprehensively, with the air of one who expected some event of import to occur. The flickering lantern in the street caught his eye, and he rose hurriedly and walked directly to the fireplace, where he stirred the boiling fluid in the vessel. The dull rap on the heavy door was answered by the soft padding of feet in the passageway. Messer Girolami's Nubian servitor admitted the hooded figure, and his lackey. There was a swish of curtains brushed aside, and the man stood in the room, his hood raised. "Messer Duca," faltered Girolami. "Indeed, it is I, Messer Girolami." "You are on time, my lord." "It is my business to make that a point, Messer." "But of course, my lord. I have no doubt that my order is filled." His Magnificence, the Duke di Sforza, reached far the embroidered purse dangling from the belt about his doublet. "I greatly fear, your Excellency." The Duke waved a jeweled hand and silenced the wizard. "Come, come, Messer Girolami, you a magician. What is there for you to fear? Are you not allied with Satan, the root of evil?" "But, my lord, I have not the elixir completed." "What knave, not completed? I am of half a mind to place your head on a pike pole." "What is the reason for this?" "It is because I lack an ingredient, Excellency." "An ingredient? Blood of Satan. Have I not given you orders to spare no sum in this matter? What ingredient is it you lack?" "It is one that gold cannot procure." "Name it. Play not with idle words." "The lifeblood of a child, Magnificence." "The lifeblood of a child? Indeed, my lord." The Duke di Sforza pondered a space. At length he glanced up. "Summon the lackey who admitted me." "As you say, Excellency." Messer Girolami vanished between the curtains, but returned almost at once, followed by the silent Nubian. "Order him to bring here for your use the first child he encounters on the streets of the city." "You heard, Nara." The Nubian nodded and trod softly from the room. Once more Messer Girolami stirred the boiling liquid over the fire. He turned the hourglass about and faced the scowling Duke. "How long, Messer Girolami, before the elixir of life will be completed?" "Until the hourglass drains thrice, Magnificence. The elixir is finished but for the blood of the child." His Excellency rose and lowered the black hood. He wrapped his cloak about him and stepped into the passageway. "When the hourglass drains thrice, Messer Girolami, I shall return." He was gone, and Messer Girolami was alone again, watching the endless stream of sand in the hourglass. Incessantly trickled the sand in the glass. Twice the wizard turned it. Somewhere in the gloomy abode a door closed softly. Impatient and apprehensive, Messer Girolami trod the oaken floor with a step that reverberated through the corridors without. The dancing flames of the fire increased the gloom by the fantastic shadows they threw about the chamber. There was no sound save the tread of the magician and the crackling fire. At length the draperies parted and the swarthy Nubian entered, a naked child stretched limply upon his great arms. Silently he laid his burden upon the table. Messer Girolami pointed to ease at the farther end of the room and murmured a command. The black turned and was lost in the dusk at the end of the room, where the flickering light could not penetrate. He reappeared out of the shadows, and the fitful flames flashed ominously on the sharp-edged blade he carried. He handed it to his master, and at the wizard's order, he grasped the unconscious boy and moved toward the fireplace. The servant held the body firmly, and with an evil calmness, the magician slashed the throat of the still form. The body quivered spasmodically as the red blood spurted from the gash into the seething liquid in the pot. Messer Girolami reseated himself and stared meditatively into the flames. For a long time he sat thus, pondering. The body of the unfortunate child lay at full length on the table, covered with a heavy cloth. At length the alchemist started up and replenished the fire and turned the hourglass. As he turned from the fireplace he faced the Duke di Sforza, who had entered silently. The firelight flickered horribly on his drawn features. "Quick, Messer Girolami, the elixir." "A space, Messer Duca, a space." The wizard grasped a goblet and walked quickly to the fireplace. He bent over the pot and dipped out a bit of the life-giving fluid. There was a rattle of coins as His Magnificence cast his pouch full of ducats upon the table. Messer Girolami took it eagerly and surrendered the elixir. The Duke waited a time for the elixir to cool, then raised the goblet to his lips and drained it. "4. It has a filthy taste, Messer, but if it accomplishes half of what is said about it, its taste is pardonable." "And that it will, my lord." "Another goblet, Messer Girolami. I must make haste, for this night has my youngest son escaped his nurse, and is now at large in the byways of Milan." "At once, Excellence. What is it you have beneath the cloth upon this table, Messer?" "It is the dead child, Magnificence. Your love of life has deprived him of it." The Duke drained the goblet. He rose, pulled his cloak about him, and started for the door, only to halt before the curtain. He walked slowly back and stood before the silent form beneath the cloth. Tentatively he stretched forth a hand, but withdrew it. "For 3 hours have we searched for my son, Messer Girolami." Again he stretched forth a hand, and again he hesitated. Messer Girolami said nothing, but his face betrayed his thoughts. Suddenly, spasmodically, the Duke snatched away the coverlet, but his nerveless fingers dropped the cloth as if it were fire. He shouted hoarsely and recoiled from the accusing body. His face blanched. He gave a low moan and stared about for the magician. But Messer Girolami had gone, and he was alone with the mutilated body of his own son, whose blood was the elixir of life. End of The Elixir of Life by Mark R. Schorer and August W. Derleth. The Coffin of Lissa by August W. Derleth. Weird Tales. October 1926. The horror of the sentence overwhelmed me. It fell upon me as the black cloak of night descending on the earth absorbed the light, so it heralded the expiration of my life. I was dazed, speechless with the portent of the verdict. The black-robed judges seemed blurred to my sight as I rose and was taken from the chamber to make room for another poor wretch. Outside, night had fallen, and the murk of the darkness still further depressed my sunken spirits. Through the pall of gloom I had discerned no ray of hope. I was doomed to die by torture, the slow torture of the iron coffin. The final words of the inquisitors reverberated hollowly in the chambers of my benumbed mind. Slowly the first shock passed, and slowly I became conscious of my surroundings. My captors were leading me through a long passageway. A few candles glimmered feebly in their brackets at the end of the ill-lighted corridor. In a few moments I faced the iron door of the torture chamber. As the heavy door creaked backward on its rusty hinges, the gleam of the flickering candles cast fitful, menacing shadows on the dreaded coffin in the center of the chamber. The sight filled me with renewed horror, and he was seized with a fierce desire for freedom. But the futile struggle that I essayed was immediately frustrated by my guards, whose strength far exceeded mine. I was roughly thrown into the instrument of torture, from which the lid had been removed. Suddenly my head struck something unyielding, and I lapsed into unconsciousness. From then on, I knew but hazily what occurred. When I awoke, my sight encountered naught save Stygian darkness. For a space I lay quiet, summoning to my aid all my faculties. Try as I might, I could not pierce the blackness. It now seemed to swirl and eddy before my eyes, and often I closed them for the relief of immovable darkness. Now suddenly I bethought myself of moving my arms, but the attempt resulted in a sharp pain at the juncture of arm and shoulder. This, thought I, could be caused by no other agency than the clamps that I had so often heard of from witnesses of an execution. At that preclusion to my efforts, the remembrance of the proceedings of some time past came upon me like a huge wave of ocean, and swept away all the remnants of thoughts that I had been collecting, leaving nothing but fear, stark terror, despair. I realized where I was, and with the realization came the thought of unhindered death. I was in the terrible iron coffin of Lissa, from which no man had ever escaped. I began to breathe heavily, and I could feel cold beads of sweat on my brow. I raved, I shouted in rage, I swore terrible oaths of vengeance against Torquemada, the Grand Inquisitor. But my exertions were too much for me, and I was forced to sink back in exhaustion. Shortly after, a reaction set in, and I lay quiet, contemplating my untimely end. I strained my ears for any sounds that might meet them. For a space I heard naught save my irregular breathing, then another sound impinged upon my ears. It was a soft padding sound, a very soft sound, scarcely audible. I listened attentively and attempted to find what occasioned it. It stopped at intervals. It resumed almost at once. Then no sound reached me for some little time, but suddenly I felt a sharp, stinging sensation in my right hand. I strove to draw it toward me, but the sharp pain in my shoulder was augmented with each movement of my arm. I groaned aloud. My arms had been drawn through apertures in the sides of the coffin. They had been chained to the stone floor for the rats to gnaw upon. Again and again I shrieked, but the more often I did so, the more acutely did I realize the utter futility of my efforts. I should not be heard here, so far underground. Even if I were heard, no one would liberate me. I sighed, and once more sank back to my rough bed exhausted. The rats were gone now, frightened, no doubt, by my wild screams of terror. But poignantly I realized that they must eventually return. I lowered my eyelids and began to mumble a silent prayer, but I was rudely interrupted. A new sound, a sound fraught with more dangers and horrors than any I had heard heretofore, reached my ears. A light sound, barely coherent, yet it was there. A creaking sound, slow, in truth, and not continuous, but its portent flung me again into the wildest throes of terror. The sound of the slow, sure descent of the coffin lid. This was the climax of the ghastly tortures I was to undergo. I raised my head to find if I could touch the oncoming lid. But I could not, and the clawing pain in my shoulders as the steel damps sank into my flesh caused me to sit back again as quickly as I could. The lid then was some distance away, and I had a few hours of grace. The certainty of death threw open the gates to my memory. I thought of my mistress and of my innocent children, and I sobbed despondently. I traversed and retraversed my entire life from the beginning of my miserable existence to this experience of horror. Gradually my sobs quieted, and I had recourse in my God. For about the space of a glass of sand I lay imperturbably, my lips moving in prayer. Then I became cognizant of the proximity of the lid. I did not again endeavor to reach the cover with my head after my former racking experience, but I resorted to another means of finding its proximity. I summoned what feeble strength I had left and forcibly blew air upward. At once I felt a draught on my face. The air had returned at the propinquity of the lid. At this discovery I sought to compose the feeling of haunting alarm which rose within me, but hardly had I attempted to do so, when a biting sensation in my hands and arms acquainted me with the return of the rats, increased in number. I shrieked and screamed to scare them off, but to no avail, for they attacked me as before. Simultaneously with these dire occurrences, a revolting nausea took possession of my senses. The air had become so foul that it oppressed me with its obnoxious poison. Cold sweat stood out in great beads upon my forehead. All my strength had deserted me. I could no longer even sob, and my breathing became more and more difficult as the lid came down. My imagination began to conjure up before me horrible visions. I believed that I saw Torquemada laughing delightedly at my sorry plight. I imagined Satan grinning at me, watching greedily for my soul. There were others too, horrible faces leering at me through the gloom. I shut my eyes, Hut. I could not shut out these damnable sights. They grew upon me. They assumed ghastly proportions, their faces twisted into horrible gargoylesque counterparts. Gradually they merged into a vague, indistinct, grotesque mass, and were swirled away by the eddying darkness. I could feel the lid now, lightly at first, for it advanced but slowly. A space passed, and the pressure began to pain me. Then came to me a last great power, and I shouted and raved, swearing horribly, until the sweat rolled down my cheeks in great drops. The pressure being me more and more pronounced, the air more obnoxious, the gnawing more persistent, the racking pain in my shoulders more torturous with each twitch, and at length I became oblivious of all. What am I doing here? Was I not in the iron coffin? Have I died and come to life? The sun easts long patches of light upon the stone floor of my cell, and forms a network of conflicting shadows with the aid of the heavy bars at my window. My clothes are torn, bedraggled. I lack 3 fingers of the right hand, and 1½ of another of the left. Why is my food reached toward me at the end of a pole? Why is the door of this room never opened? Why does my keeper hurl disgusting epithets at me every time he nears me? What is the meaning of all this? Why am I called such unbearable bestial names? Above all, why am I so unjustly called that which is most oft repeated, that which of all I deserve the least? Lunatic. At this word there comes upon me again that horrible nausea that attacked me in the Coffin of Lissa, and I shriek in terror as those memories surge over me like the resistless waves of ocean, and as my screams reverberate down the corridor, answering Syriams come from other eels, and my keeper laughs and shouts filthy curses at me. End of The Coffin of Lissa by August W. Derleth. The Night Rider by August W. Derleth. Weird Tales. January 1927. Up, Madonna. There was a silence. Bah! The old crone has fallen asleep. Messer Morini rose, walked over to the sleeper, and shook her vehemently. Up, Madonna Lucrezia, up. Eh? What is it, Messer Morini? Up, Madonna. Can you not hear the hoofbeats of some rider in the distance on the highway? You dream, Messer. There is nothing. Away with you. Let me sleep. He moved away, grumbling. Madonna Lucrezia's head sank upon her breast and she drowsed. Messer Morini vanished through the heavy curtains at one extremity of the room. He walked through an ill-lighted passageway to where a heavily panelled door loomed before him. He unlatched the door and walked quietly out into the still summer night, through the court, to the iron paling separating him from the highway, which stretched itself far in the distance on either side, a ghastly white in the moonlight. The sound of hard riding came to him, and he stood still, listening. The sound came nearer and nearer, and he wondered who rode so close to the hour of midnight. There was a low mumbling sound behind him, and he heard the heavy door swing softly to. He turned. Madonna Lucrezia had followed him. The hoofbeats sounded nearer. He turned to the old woman at his side. Now tell me that I was in error, Madonna. "You dream," she answered, and smothered a yawn. "Dream, Madonna? Bah! You are yet in your sleep." And he turned away and looked up the road to where he could discern a dark speck moving swiftly toward him. "There, Madonna," he indicated the rider. "There, can you deny the evidence of your eyes?" The woman stared at him suspiciously and remained silent. "Dreaming? I dreaming? Now say that I dream, Madonna." Still the old woman did not answer. She frowned and glanced up at him, her thin, bloodless lips twisted into a sullen grin. The rider was almost up to them. "See the superb white steed he rides, Madonna, and his wondrous silver cloak. His doublet, too, is silver, but there is a stain as of blood upon it. His face I cannot see. It seems a mist is before it." The rider swept by, but still the old woman said nothing, staring at Messer Morini gesticulating and pointing at the night rider fast disappearing down the road. Messer Morini swore softly under his breath. "By the Madonna, but he looked like my son, my Alessandro. If it were not that I could not see his face, did he not resemble my son, Madonna?" The old woman made no answer, but turned and entered the house, crooning softly to herself. He followed her, grumbling, "Bah! The old hag walks in her sleep." In the house she sat again by the fireplace, still crooning as she watched the flames lick at the stones to the sides. Messer Morini sat near. "I wonder, Madonna." He lapsed into silence. The old woman chuckled a bit, but gave no hint of having heard Messer Morini, and went on with her crooning. "I wonder what my son could be doing riding near here. Could he have deserted the army? Or could the invader Charles have defeated and routed our troops? It is not likely so," he mused. It was high noon. The hot sun beat down upon the court, wilting even the blades of grass. Messer Morini dozed in the shade of a huge tree near the iron paling. A bird chirped shrilly as it hopped merrily about on the sundial nearby. No breath of air stirred the leaves above Messer Morini's head. Suddenly the distant clatter of hoofs resounded in the courtyard. The bird ceased its chirping and stood quite still in the shadow on the dial. Messer Morini raised his head. A breath of air came and rustled the leaves of the tree. The hoofbeats sounded louder. From somewhere in the house came a muffled sound. The horseman came nearer. Messer Morini rose and leaned over the gate to stare up the road. A sharp edge caught and tore his doublet a little. Madonna Lucrezia stood in the doorway. The rider appeared up the road. The bird on the sundial flew up into the tree and hid itself among the leaves. Madonna Lucrezia moved forward and took her stand at Messer Morini's side. The rider came on, slackening his pace as he approached the two leaning over the gate. "He is of the army," Messer Morini whispered. Madonna Lucrezia grunted in reply. The horseman pulled to a stop before the two. "Oh, Messer, is this the house of Messer Morini?" "You address him. I am instructed to inform you that your son, Alessandro, was killed last night just before the midnight hour in an encounter with the invading Charles. He received a poniard stab in the breast." He bowed to Messer Morini, put the spurs to his horse, and turned away in a cloud of dust. "My son, Alessandro, dead." Messer Morini shook his fist at the fast-vanishing figure. "Bearer of ill tidings, a curse on you." He turned to the woman. "You heard him, Madonna?" The old woman nodded assent. "Aye, I heard him. I would have sworn it was my son who rode last night." The woman turned on him. "You were mad last night, Messer Morini." "How? Mad?" "Mad! For while you pointed, gesticulated, shouted descriptions into my ears of some rider who you affirmed passed, I neither heard nor saw a solitary living thing upon the road." And she moved toward the house, chuckling. End of The Night Rider by August W. Derleth.